You ever see Jeepers Creepers? The old one. If you have, good. If you haven't, don't worry, it'll make sense later. Anyway, my name is Andre Williams, and I've worked the night shift at Hoover Dam for almost 9 years. Honestly, it's a pretty good job. The pay's great, the benefits are solid, most nights are quiet. That's why I took it. Before this, I'd worked security in warehouses, office buildings, and a natural gas plant outside Las Vegas. Nothing exciting. Just 12-hour shifts, a flashlight, a radio, and enough coffee to stay awake until sunrise. When the opening at Hoover Dam popped up online, I applied the same day. A week later, they called me. Another week after that, I was standing on top of one of the most famous structures in America. Most people think Hoover Dam is just a giant wall holding back Lake Mead. It isn't. It's basically a small city built inside concrete. There are miles of tunnels running through the dam, generator rooms bigger than basketball courts, maintenance passages that seem to go on forever, elevators, stairwells, control rooms, pump rooms, catwalks hanging hundreds of feet above spinning turbines. You could work here for years and still never see every part of it. During the day, the place is packed. Tour buses, families, school field trips, people taking selfies. You'd never believe how many tourists try climbing over railings just to get a better picture. Every now and then, somebody drops a phone over the edge. Sometimes a hat. One guy somehow managed to drop both. By 6 o'clock every evening, though, almost all of them are gone. The gates close, the tour elevators stop running, the gift shop shuts down, and the dam becomes quiet. Not silent. A place like Hoover Dam is never silent. You can always hear the generators humming somewhere below your feet. You can hear water moving through pipes bigger than houses. You can hear ventilation fans pushing air through tunnels carved into the concrete almost 90 years ago. After a while, you stop noticing those sounds. They just kind of become part of the job. There are usually only a few dozen of us working nights. Maintenance crews, engineers, electricians, security. Everyone pretty much knows everybody else. My shifts were simple enough. Walk the property, check secured doors, replace lights when maintenance needed an extra hand, inspect fences, respond if an alarm went off. Most nights, nothing happened. Honestly, I preferred it that way. If I wanted excitement, I would have become a cop or a firefighter. Instead, I got paid to walk around one of the biggest engineering projects ever built. Hard to complain. The first week was mostly training, generator safety, electrical hazards, heat exhaustion, emergency evacuation routes, what to do if someone fell into a restricted area. The instructors covered everything you'd expect, nothing more. Nobody mentioned hearing children. Nobody mentioned red water or balloons. If they had, I probably would have assumed they were messing with the new guy. Instead, my first real shift started at exactly 7 o'clock on a Tuesday night. My supervisor, Scott Jackson, met me inside the employee entrance with a flashlight in one hand and a ring of keys hanging from his belt. He looked at me for a second, and then he asked me the strangest question I've ever heard at a job. You ever see Jeepers Creepers? Rule 1. Never drink the water between midnight and 1 a.m. Scott didn't tell me the first rule on my first night, or my second. Honestly, he let me work for almost 2 weeks before he ever brought it up. By then, I'd settled into a routine. I'd clock in around 7, grab my radio, check the maintenance board to see if anything needed attention, then start my rounds. Most nights, I'd spend a few hours walking the tunnels inside the dam, checking locked doors, replacing burned-out lights, or escorting contractors into restricted areas. Around 10, I'd usually take my lunch in the employee break room before finishing the rest of my shift. It was easy work, quiet. Exactly what I wanted. The break room wasn't anything special. A few vending machines, a fridge that was probably older than I was, a microwave that sounded like it was about to explode every time somebody used it. There was also a sink and one of those bottle filling stations people always use nowadays. I probably filled my water bottle 3 or 4 times every shift. The water came straight from Lake Mead after being treated. It was cold and clean, tasted fine, at least during the day. The first time Scott mentioned the rule, it was completely out of nowhere. It was a little before midnight. We just finished helping maintenance replace a light fixture near one of the generator rooms. By the time we got back upstairs, I realized my water bottle was empty. I walked over to the bottle station. Scott cleared his throat behind me. "Don't." I looked back at him. "Don't what?" "Don't fill it." I laughed. "It's empty." "I know." "So?" He checked his watch. 11:58. Then he looked back at me. "Wait an hour." I stared at him for a second before laughing again. "Seriously?" He nodded. I figured he was messing with me. I shrugged and reached for the button anyway. Scott grabbed my wrist before I could press it. Not hard, just enough to stop me. "I'm not joking, Andre." Something in his voice made me stop smiling. He let go of my wrist and pointed at the clock on the wall. "Come back at 1. "Why?" "You'll see." Neither of us said another word. We sat down at one of the tables in the break room. Scott drank coffee, and I sat there wondering what kind of joke he was setting up. The clock slowly rolled over midnight. Nothing happened. I looked at Scott, and he didn't say anything. And about 30 seconds later, I heard it. We both looked toward the sink. A faucet that had been turned off all night had started dripping by itself. One drop, then another, then another. Scott stood up. We walked into the hallway. Every employee sink we passed was doing the same thing. Slow dripping. One of the electricians walked by carrying a toolbox. He didn't even look surprised. Just kept walking. When we reached the next water fountain, Scott nodded toward it. "Go ahead." I leaned down, and the water wasn't clear anymore. It was red, almost like rust, except it wasn't rust. The entire stream had changed color. I remember just standing there staring at it. "What the hell?" Scott interrupted me. "Don't drink it." We walked to another fountain. Same thing. Then another. Same thing again. We checked a sink inside one of the maintenance rooms. Red. Every faucet, fountain, bottle station, every pipe carrying drinking water through Hoover Dam. From exactly midnight until 1 in the morning, the water turned red. At exactly 1 o'clock, it went back to normal. Just like somebody had flipped a switch. Clear, cold, perfectly clean. I spent the next week trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe it was sediment. Maybe some strange mineral from Lake Mead. Maybe maintenance flushed the pipes every night. But none of those explanations made sense. If it were sediment, it wouldn't happen at the exact same minute every single night. If it were maintenance, somebody would have mentioned it. Eventually, I stopped asking questions. Everyone on the night shift already knew. They'd known for years. Scott finally told me where the rule came from. About 12 years ago, before I started working there, a new maintenance worker named Joel Bailey decided the older guys were full of it. He waited until 12:15, walked over to a fountain, filled an entire paper cup, then drank it while everyone watched. He smiled, held up the empty cup, and asked if that was all they had. Well, nothing happened then. Joel finished the rest of his shift and went home. The next day he called in sick. Scott said Joel told his supervisor he couldn't get the taste of blood out of his mouth. Didn't matter what he ate or drank. Everything tasted like blood. His doctor couldn't find anything wrong. Dentist couldn't find anything wrong. And a week later, Joel quit. Nobody at Hoover Dam ever saw him again. Now, maybe it was all in his head. Maybe there was another explanation. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that I've worked here for almost 9 years, and I have never taken a single drink of water between midnight and 1 o'clock. Not once. Rule 2. If you hear wings flying above you, go inside immediately. You ever see Jeepers Creepers? The old one? The guy in the trench coat, big hat, even bigger wings. I remember watching it years before I ever worked at Hoover Dam. I thought it was creepy, sure, but still just a movie. And then I started working nights here. The first time Scott Jackson brought it up, I laughed. "The movie?" I asked. Scott nodded. "Do you remember the wings?" "Yeah." "Good." That was all he said. He didn't explain what he meant. He just kept walking down the inspection tunnel like we'd been talking about the weather. I figured he was just another older guy trying to mess with a new employee. Every workplace has stories, you know? Construction workers have ghost stories. Truck drivers have haunted highways. Security guards swear abandoned buildings aren't really abandoned. I figured Hoover Dam was no different. I was wrong. The story everyone tells new hires starts with a man named Christian Black. Nobody agrees on exactly how old the story is anymore. Some guys say it happened in 2014. Others swear it was 2016. Scott always said the exact year, it didn't matter. The only part that matters, he'd tell people, is what happened after he looked up. Christian worked the night maintenance crew. From everything I heard, he was a good worker. Showed up early, never complained, never cut corners. Kind of guy everyone wanted on their shift. Well, one August night, he was assigned to inspect the warning lights that run across the top of the dam. Simple job, really. Walk the roadway, make sure every light is working, replace bulbs if needed, report any damage. You spend most of the shift completely alone. By that point, the tourists are gone, the traffic is stopped, even the wind usually dies down after midnight. It's surprisingly peaceful up there. Christian liked listening to music while he worked. Technically, you weren't supposed to wear earbuds during inspections. Too many safety risks. But people did it anyway. One earbud in, one ear open. That was usually enough. Security cameras followed most of his route across the dam. Scott showed me the footage during my first month. Not officially. He wasn't supposed to have a copy. He just told me to sit down in the security office after lunch one night. "I want you to see something." The video looked completely normal. Christian walked across the roadway with a flashlight in one hand and a clipboard tucked under one arm. Every few seconds, he'd stop beside another light, write something down, then keep moving. Nothing unusual, nothing scary, nothing that would have made anyone remember that night. But then Christian stopped walking. Not suddenly, almost like he'd heard something. He reached up, pulled one earbud out, tilted his head, listened. Scott paused the video. "What do you hear?" I shrugged. "Nothing." "Exactly." He pressed play again. Christian slowly looked up toward the night sky. Not straight up, just enough to follow something moving over him. The security camera flickered once. Then again. The screen filled with static for maybe 3 seconds, and when the picture came back, Christian was gone. His flashlight was lying on the concrete. One white earbud rested a few feet away. That was it. No blood, no signs of a struggle, no damaged railing. Nothing. I remember staring at the monitor for a long time before finally speaking. "So, he fell?" I asked. Scott shook his head. No. Search team spent 3 days looking." I watched the last few seconds of the footage again. There wasn't enough time. Even if Christian had somehow climbed the barrier and jumped, he couldn't have disappeared that fast. Not in 3 seconds. I looked over at Scott, and then he said something that stuck with me. "The report also leaves something out. There were 4 other workers on shift that night. They were all inside different parts of the dam, and they all reported hearing the same thing." I felt a knot form in my stomach. He looked toward the office window for a few seconds before speaking. "Wings. Big ones." Now, nobody saw anything. By the time they reached where Christian stopped answering his radio, he was already gone. The official investigation blamed an accidental fall. Case closed. Scott told me nobody in the night crew believed that. Not a single one. After hearing the story, I started paying attention whenever I worked outside. Not because I believed all of it, because stories like that, they've got a way of getting into your head. Every owl suddenly sounded louder. Every gust of wind made me glance upward. Sometimes bats flew around the lights near the intake towers, and I'd catch myself watching them longer than I should. And then almost 3 years later, I heard it. I was walking back toward the employee entrance after checking a security gate on the Arizona side. It was around 2 a.m. Perfectly clear night. No wind or traffic, nothing, and then I stopped walking. Something else, slower this time. It didn't sound mechanical. It sounded alive. Huge. Like something with wings was moving through the darkness above me. I remember then exactly what Scott had said years earlier. If you ever hear wings, don't stop to figure out who they belong to. Don't look. Just get inside. For 1 second, I almost stopped and looked. Human curiosity, it's a funny thing. Part of me wanted to know, wanted proof. Wanted to see whatever had made Christian stop and look all those years before. Instead, I lowered my head, grabbed my radio, and I started running toward the nearest security door. The sound came once more, closer this time. Then it stopped. I slammed the steel door behind me so hard the windows rattled. The hallway was empty. Only the steady hum of the generators echoed through the concrete. Well, I stood there for almost a full minute trying to catch my breath. Scott happened to walk around the corner and carrying a toolbox. And one look at my face told him everything. You heard him. It wasn't a question. I nodded. He looked toward the closed door behind me, then back at me. You look up? I shook my head. No. And for the first time since I'd met him, Scott smiled. Good, he said quietly. That's why you're still here. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Not because I believed I'd almost been carried off by some giant flying creature, because I didn't. At least not yet. I kept telling myself there had to be another explanation. Maybe a large bird. Maybe some strange echo bouncing off the canyon walls. Every explanation sounded reasonable. At first. Scott never brought it up again. That was another thing about the night crew. Nobody liked talking about the rules once you learned them. It wasn't some secret club. It was more like everybody had already accepted there wasn't an answer. You learned the rule, you followed it, then you moved on. A few nights later, I asked one of the electricians if he'd ever heard the wings. He looked at me for a couple seconds before answering. Once. What'd you do? Exactly what Scott told you. Did you look? He shook his head no, and walked away. Over the next few years, I worked hundreds of night shifts on top of that dam. Sometimes I'd spend 3 or 4 hours outside. Summer or winter, didn't matter. I'd walk the same inspection routes Christian Black once had, check the same lights, unlock the same gates, sign the same inspection sheets. Every now and then, I'd catch myself looking up into the night sky. Not because I'd heard anything, just because I was thinking about him. Thinking about those 3 seconds. It's amazing how much your imagination can do with 3 missing seconds. Maybe he really did fall. Maybe the camera really did fail at exactly the wrong moment. Maybe everyone inside the dam imagined hearing wings because they'd already convinced themselves something strange had happened. All of those explanations, they are possible. They're also a lot easier to live with. Still, there's one thing I've never been able to explain. Every security camera on Hoover Dam stores its footage for years. Maintenance videos, traffic cameras, inspection recordings. Everything. Except not one. Christian's recording disappears right after the static. I've asked around more than once. The official answer is that the file was corrupted. Maybe it was. Or maybe someone decided nobody needed to keep watching those 3 seconds over and over again. I honestly don't know. What I do know is this. I've heard the wings once. Scott heard them twice. The electrician heard them once. And none of us looked. Christian Black did. And whether you believe the old stories or not, he is the only one who never came back. So if you're ever working the night shift at Hoover Dam, and everything suddenly goes quiet, and you hear something enormous beating the air above your head, don't try to figure out what it is. Don't convince yourself it's just a bird. Don't tell yourself you're being paranoid. Don't look up. Just run. Rule 3. Never stand too close to the edge. Now, not every rule at Hoover Dam exists because of something supernatural. Some of them exist because this place is dangerous enough all by itself. People forget how massive Hoover Dam really is. Pictures don't do it justice. Standing on top of it doesn't either. It's only when you walk the maintenance routes at night that your brain finally understands the scale of the place. The top of the dam sits more than 700 feet above the Colorado River. The concrete curves away beneath your feet until it almost disappears into the darkness below. During the day, tourists lean over the railings to take pictures without thinking twice about it. At night, it's different. There are fewer lights. The canyon below becomes one giant black shadow. You can still hear the river, but you can't always see it. Sometimes, all you can make out is a faint strip of moonlight reflecting off the water hundreds of feet below. It's enough to remind you that one mistake is all it would take. Most of the inspections we do are routine, checking warning lights, looking for damage along the railings, making sure gates are locked, verifying cameras are still online, the kind of work that gets repetitive after a while. And that's exactly when people become careless. Scott used to tell me the same thing every week. Don't let the routine fool you. One windy night during my second year, maintenance called us out because one of the warning lights near the Arizona side had stopped working. Wasn't urgent, just another burned out bulb. Scott and I grabbed a replacement and headed out. The weather had changed since sunset. The wind coming through Black Canyon was stronger than usual. Not enough to shut down work, just enough that you noticed. Every few minutes, it would whistle across the top of the dam before disappearing into the darkness below. Scott walked ahead of me, carrying the toolbox. I looked over the side for a second. Big mistake. Even after working there for 2 years, looking straight down still made my stomach tighten. The river looked impossibly small. Cars crossing the bridge in the distance looked like toys. The wind suddenly picked up. Not much, just enough to make me instinctively shift my weight. Well, we replaced the light in less than 10 minutes. On the walk back, we passed one of the maintenance pullouts overlooking the canyon. There wasn't much there, just a short section where crews could stage equipment during larger repairs. Scott stopped walking. Come here for a second. I walked over. Painted on the concrete, almost faded away after years in the sun, was a yellow line about 3 feet from the edge. I'd walked past it dozens of times, never paid attention to it. What is it? I asked. Scott shrugged. Nobody really knows. What do you mean? It was already here when I started. So why not repaint it? We do, he said. He looked toward the edge. To remind people. Remind them of what? I asked. How somebody thought it needed painting in the first place. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing the same yellow line in several places across the dam. Always near maintenance areas, always a few feet back from the edge. Never mentioned on any official map, never discussed during training, just there. One night I asked one of the engineers about it. He looked where I was pointing. Oh, that. Stay behind it. That's all he said, and and then he walked away. Nobody ever gave me a better answer. Eventually, I stopped asking. Instead, I started paying attention. Whenever I worked outside, I'd noticed that every experienced employee naturally stayed behind those yellow lines. One night, a contractor stepped right over one while carrying a coil of cable. Scott called him back immediately. "Behind the line." The contractor laughed. "I'm still 10 feet from the edge." "I know." "So what's the problem?" Scott didn't answer. He just kept staring until the contractor finally stepped back. The rest of us never crossed it. Maybe it was only a safety tradition. Maybe the line meant absolutely nothing. Or maybe, after working Hoover Dam long enough, you stop ignoring the little habits the older guys have, because every single one of them started for a reason. So that's rule 3, never stand too close to the edge. Maybe it's just because the drop is over 700 feet. Maybe it's because the wind through Black Canyon can surprise you. Or maybe some rules don't need an explanation. Rule 4. If you hear a child calling from the water at 3:33 a.m., don't answer. The first time Scott told me about Rule 4, we were sitting in the maintenance office finishing paperwork after a 12-hour shift. It was almost sunrise, and everyone else had already gone home. Scott was signing inspection sheets while I cleaned out my locker. Without looking up, he asked me a strange question. "You got kids?" I shook my head. "No." "Nieces? Nephews?" My sister's got 2, I said. Scott nodded. If you ever hear one of them calling for help out on the reservoir, don't answer." Scott slid the clipboard into a filing cabinet and locked it. "I'm serious, Andre." That was the entire conversation. And for almost a year, I forgot about it. Unlike the red water or the stories about wings, Rule 4 almost never came up. Nobody talked about it in the break room. Nobody joked about it during inspections. Even the older guys avoided the subject. It was almost like saying too much about it somehow made it worse. The reservoir above the dam, it's enormous. During the day, it's full of boats, fishermen, kayaks, and tourists. At night, it's empty. That's one of the strangest things about working there. You can stand on top of the dam at 2 a.m. and look across miles of perfectly still water without seeing a single light. No boats, no voices, no engines. Just darkness. Sometimes, the moon reflects off the surface so perfectly it looks like polished glass. Other nights, you can't tell where the water ends and the sky begins. My job took me up there a few times every month. Usually it was something simple. Checking security fences, inspecting floodlights, walking the shoreline near the intake structures. Nothing exciting. One October night, I was doing exactly that. It had been unusually quiet. No wind or insects. Even the water looked frozen. I remember checking my watch while walking along the access road. 3:31 a.m. I still had one more gate to inspect before heading back inside, and that's when I heard it. "Mister..." The voice was quiet. So quiet, I honestly thought I'd imagined it. I stopped walking. The flashlight hung loosely at my side. Nothing, no movement or boats or people. I started walking again. "Mister..." This time it was clearer. A little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old. She sounded scared, not screaming or crying, just scared. I slowly turned my flashlight toward the shoreline. Nothing. The beam stretched across the water without finding anything. And then I remembered what time it was. 3:33. Every hair on my arm stood up. The voice came again. "I'm cold." It wasn't far away, maybe 50 yards, somewhere out in the water. My first instinct was exactly what you'd expect. Somebody needed help. A child was out there. People don't stop to analyze things like that. You just react. I took one step toward the shoreline, then another. The rocks shifted under my boots. The voice sounded stronger now. Please, I can't get out. I grabbed my radio. This is Andre. Is anybody working the North Access Road? Static. Then Scott's voice. I'm here. Yeah, I think there's somebody in the water. No. I hear a little girl. No, you don't. His answer caught me completely off guard. What? You stay where you are. I'm telling you, Scott, there's... Andre. His voice had changed. It wasn't loud, but it was the most serious I'd ever heard him. Do not go any closer. I looked back toward the reservoir. The surface hadn't changed, still perfectly calm and empty. And then the little girl spoke. This time she used my name. Andre. I felt my stomach drop. I'd never reported my location over the radio. I'd never answered whoever or whatever was out there. Yet somehow it knew my name. I took another step backward. Scott was still talking through the radio. Keep walking toward the access gate. What is it? Just walk. The little girl's voice became more desperate then. Please, my daddy left me. I don't want to die. And then the crying stopped. Complete silence. For maybe 5 seconds. When the voice returned, it wasn't a little girl anymore. The words were the same, but the voice wasn't. Andre, come play with me. The sound rolled across the water like thunder. I didn't wait for Scott to tell me again. I turned around and I started running as fast as I could. Behind me, the voice laughed. Not a child's laugh, not even close. Every few seconds, it would almost get it right before slipping back into something much older. By the time I reached the security gate, Scott was already waiting for me. He didn't ask what I'd heard. He didn't need to. One look at my face was enough. We stood there for almost a minute without speaking. Finally, I asked him the question I'd been thinking ever since the radio call. Has anyone ever gone looking? Scott stared out across the black water. A long time ago. What happened? They never found anybody. The child? I asked. He slowly shook his head. There wasn't one. Neither of us spoke after that. We locked the gate, finished the rest of our inspections, and watched the clock. The reservoir looked completely normal again. Just miles of silent water reflecting the moon. I don't know what calls from that reservoir, but if you ever find yourself working the night shift at the dam, and you hear a frightened child calling for help from the middle of a perfectly still reservoir at exactly 3:33 in the morning, don't answer. Rule 5. Never enter an unassigned maintenance tunnel alone. By the time you make it to Rule 5, you've usually stopped asking why the rules exist. You just follow them. Some make sense, some don't. Either way, they keep you alive. The 5th rule is surprisingly ordinary compared to the others. At least that's what I thought. Never enter an unassigned maintenance tunnel alone. Sounded like standard workplace safety. Buddy system. Confined spaces, nothing unusual. And then I actually started working inside the tunnels. From the outside, the dam doesn't look all that complicated. It's one giant wall of concrete holding back an enormous reservoir. Simple enough. Inside, it's a maze. There are maintenance galleries, drainage galleries, electrical corridors, ventilation passages, equipment rooms, inspection shafts, and stairwells connecting levels that seem to go on forever. Some tunnels are wide enough to drive a pickup truck through. Others barely let two people squeeze past each other. Almost every hallway looks the same. Gray concrete, steel doors, yellow safety rails, rows of pipes disappearing into the darkness. After a few hours underground, you completely lose your sense of direction. There aren't any windows. You can't see the sun. You can't hear traffic. The only constant is the low vibration from the generators. Eventually, every corridor starts looking identical. Scott warned me about that during training. Never trust your memory down here. I've got the maps, I said. You might not when the power goes out, he said. Every employee carried a radio, a flashlight, and a laminated map of the tunnel system. That sounds reassuring until you realize there are hundreds of intersections. A wrong turn doesn't usually put you in danger, it just wastes time. Most nights, that's all it is. Most nights. Well, one winter evening, maintenance reported a pressure sensor that had stopped responding. It wasn't a major repair, someone just needed to confirm the wiring hadn't been damaged. Scott was busy helping another crew, so he pointed toward the maintenance office. Grab the blueprints, I'll meet you down there. No problem, I said. I picked up the map, checked the tunnel number, and headed downstairs. The first 10 minutes were completely normal. Concrete corridor, left turn, steel door, another corridor, exactly like every other inspection. And then I reached a 4-way intersection. According to the map, I needed to go left. Except, there wasn't a left. The hallway shown on the blueprint simply didn't exist. Instead, there were 3 identical corridors stretching away into the darkness. I checked the map again. Same result. Wrong layout. I figured I'd counted intersections incorrectly. Easy mistake. So I picked the center hallway. 5 minutes later, I found another intersection, and again, it didn't match the map. I stopped walking, pulled out my radio. Yeah, this is Andre. Static. Scott, you copy? Nothing. I tried again, still nothing. The radio had worked perfectly upstairs, and now, just silence. That was the first time I realized how quiet those tunnels could become. Without the radio chatter, without footsteps, without anyone talking. All I could hear was the distant hum of machinery somewhere inside the concrete. It almost sounded like breathing. I told myself not to be ridiculous. This place was nearly 100 years old. Old buildings make noise, pipes expand, fans cycle on and off. Concrete settles. There was a logical explanation for everything. I took another hallway, then another. Nothing looked familiar. Every door had the same paint. Every light fixture looked identical. Every corridor stretched into another corridor. I checked my watch. Almost 40 minutes had passed. The repair should have taken 10. And for one of the first times since starting the job, I felt genuinely uncomfortable. I had absolutely no idea where I was. I stopped again and listened. Somewhere far ahead, I heard footsteps. Finally, somebody else was down here. Hello? No answer. The footsteps continued. Heavy work boots by the side of them. I started walking toward them, and the strange thing was, I never got closer. No matter how fast I walked, they stayed exactly the same distance away. Always around the next corner, always just out of sight. I called out again. Nothing, just footsteps. By then, I wasn't even thinking about the broken pressure sensor anymore. I just wanted another human being, another radio, another voice. I turned another corner, empty hallway. I heard the footsteps behind me then. I spun around. Nothing. The corridor I just walked through was completely empty. The footsteps stopped then. Every instinct I had told me to start running. Instead, I forced myself to stand still, take a breath, think. Scott always said panic was the quickest way to get lost. I closed my eyes for a second, listened. The generators, the ventilation fans, water moving somewhere inside the structure. And then faintly, a radio. Andre? Scott. I couldn't make out the words, only my name. I answered immediately. This is Andre. Static, then. Don't move. The transmission was broken, but it was enough. I stayed exactly where I was. Less than 2 minutes later, Scott rounded the corner carrying another flashlight. "You alright?" I got turned around. "I know." "How'd you find me?" He held up a small tracking receiver clipped to his belt. "Your radio." On the way back, I asked him about the footsteps. He didn't even look at me. "What footsteps?" "The ones I kept hearing." Scott was quiet for several seconds. Finally, he shrugged. "Yeah, I've heard them too." "You ever figure out what they were?" "No." "Were they another worker?" "I never found anybody." That was all he said. We finished the repair together. Took less than 5 minutes. As we climbed back into the main access corridor, I looked over my shoulder one last time. The tunnel was empty. Completely still. Nothing chasing us, nothing standing in the darkness. Just another stretch of gray concrete disappearing underground. Now maybe I imagined the footsteps. Maybe stress and isolation got the better of me. Maybe old tunnels play tricks on your ears. But I don't think so. Rule 6. If you ever see red balloons floating out of one of the drains, run. By the time I learned the 6th rule, I'd stopped trying to decide which stories were real and which ones weren't. I had seen enough strange things to understand one simple fact. You don't have to understand a rule to follow it. You just have to survive long enough to learn why it exists. The 6th rule wasn't written anywhere. Wasn't in the employee handbook. Wasn't posted on a bulletin board. Scott didn't even tell me himself. I overheard it. It was just after 2 in the morning, and a water main had burst inside one of the lower maintenance galleries. Half the night crew had been called in to help shut off valves before the flooding reached an electrical room. For almost 3 hours, everyone was busy. Maintenance, security, engineers. Even supervisors were carrying pumps and hoses. By the time we finally finished, everybody was exhausted. A few of us ended up sitting outside one of the service buildings, drinking bad coffee from paper cups while we waited for the maintenance report to be finished. Nobody was talking much. And then one of the older mechanics looked toward a storm drain near the edge of the roadway. "Been about 9 years," he muttered. Another guy nodded. "Closer to 10. Scott looked up immediately. "Don't start." "I'm just saying. We're due." Nobody laughed. Nobody asked what he meant. The conversation simply died. About 5 minutes later, everyone stood up, threw away their empty cups, and went back to work. I caught up with Scott before we headed inside. "What was that about?" "What?" "The balloons," I said. He frowned. "I didn't say anything about balloons." No, the mechanic did. I overheard him talking about it." Scott stopped walking. For a second, I thought he wasn't going to answer. And then finally he said, "Forget you heard it." "So there are balloons?" "No." "You literally just, there are no balloons," he interrupted. He unlocked the security door and stepped inside. The conversation was over. That should have been enough, but it wasn't. The problem with telling someone to forget something is that it's almost impossible to do. Over the next few weeks, I started asking around. Not directly, just little questions. Nobody gave me a straight answer. Some people pretended they had no idea what I was talking about. Others simply changed the subject. One maintenance worker actually walked away in the middle of our conversation. That was unusual. The night crew talked about everything. Equipment failures, paychecks, sports, ghost stories. They never walked away. Unless the subject was balloons. About a month later, I finally got an answer, or at least part of one. Scott and I were inspecting one of the lower drainage galleries after a heavy rainstorm. Most people don't realize how much water moves through a dam besides the reservoir itself. Rainwater, groundwater, runoff, all has to go somewhere. The drainage system underneath the structure stretches for miles. Most of it is concrete tunnels just large enough for two people to walk side by side. Cold, wet, always echoing. We were checking for debris that might have blocked one of the grates. Scott stopped beside a rust-covered drain cover and shined his flashlight inside. Clear. I checked the other one. Also clear. And then something caught my eye farther down the tunnel, maybe 50 yards away. Something bright red. At first I thought it was a warning flag somebody had dropped. And then it moved, slowly, floating. I narrowed my flashlight beam. It wasn't a flag. It was a balloon. Bright red. It drifted upward from the darkness beneath the drain tunnel, as if someone below had just let go of the string. It simply floated there, silent, turning slowly in the stale air. I stared at it for several seconds before speaking. Scott? He was already looking. The color drained from his face. For the first time since I'd met him, I saw genuine fear. He grabbed my arm hard enough to make me stumble. We're leaving, right now. He didn't raise his voice, but there was something in his eyes I'd never seen before. The kind of look people get when they've recognized something that they hoped they would never see again. He pulled me toward the tunnel entrance, and I looked back one last time. There were 2 balloons now, then 3, all of them rising silently from the darkness below. Scott grabbed my arm before I could take another step, and for just a split second, I looked back. 2 yellow eyes were staring up at me from the darkness below. We didn't wait to see anything else. The steel door slammed shut, and a single heavy impact echoed from the other side. Well, we finished out the rest of our shift and went home that morning. But I have never forgotten that night. The strange thing is, life eventually settled back into something that almost felt normal. Not normal by anyone else's standards, obviously, but normal for us. The water still turned red every night between midnight and 1. Every new employee still got warned about wearing earbuds outside after dark. The yellow lines were still repainted every few years. Nobody answered voices coming from the reservoir. Nobody entered maintenance tunnels alone. And nobody ever mentioned the balloons. You stop asking why after a while. You stop trying to solve every mystery. Instead, you learn the rules, you follow them, then you go home. I think that surprises people. They imagine working somewhere like this would feel terrifying every single night. It doesn't. Most nights are completely ordinary. You check doors, replace light bulbs, walk your route, fill out paperwork, drink coffee, and watch the sun come up. And then you drive home like anyone else after a long shift. Sometimes months go by without anything unusual. Long enough that you almost convince yourself the older guys were just telling stories. Long enough that you start wondering if maybe you imagined some of it yourself. And then something happens. A faucet starts dripping just before midnight. A sound echoes across the top of the dam that shouldn't exist. A voice calls your name from the water. Footsteps follow you through an empty tunnel. Or you catch a flash of red just out of the corner of your eye. And suddenly every story you've ever been told comes rushing back. People ask me all the time if I'd ever take another job. Maybe, someday. I've thought about it more than once. But then I ask myself a simple question. If I left, who would warn the next guy? Because nobody puts those rules in the employee handbook. You only hear them from the people who've survived long enough to pass them on. Maybe that's why they're still around. So if you ever find yourself working the night shift somewhere old, somewhere built out of thousands of tons of concrete, somewhere with endless tunnels beneath your feet and miles of black water behind your back, listen to the old guy training you, even if what he says sounds impossible. Especially then, because every rule has a story. My name is Adam. I'm a consulting detective, which is a fancy way of saying people pay me to solve things they're too embarrassed to take to the cops. Missing husbands, dead cats in the mailbox, a smell coming from the neighbor's basement, that kind of thing. I run my office out of what used to be a failed Chinese joint down on Harmon Alley, behind a strip of laundromats and a donut shop that's always out of everything. There's no sign out front. If you don't already know where to look, you probably don't belong here. Inside, there are 2 desks. One is mine. It's solid oak, old, scarred with burns and knife marks, none of which are from me. The other belongs to Clive, my assistant, which is a generous term for someone who once tried to microwave a case file. The walls are a disaster. Peeling paint, water stains that look like South America. Newspaper clippings are thumbtacked into every inch of free space. Old missing posters, crime scene photos, scribbled notes that made sense once, but don't anymore. Even the bathroom's got sticky notes over the toilet tank. One of them says, "Don't trust the goblin with the orange shoes." I don't remember who wrote that. I do remember trusting a goblin with orange shoes, and I have a scar on my back to remind me of it. The kitchen's down the hall, or what used to be a kitchen, back when someone thought this place could pass health inspection. We turned it into a case file library. Boxes stacked to the ceiling, half of them are full of books. Clive says some are rare occult volumes. I think most are trashy horror novels with the covers ripped off. Either way, they collect dust the same. You'll find coffee mugs in every room. None of them clean. Some still have liquid in them. Some have life forms. Every once in a while, Clive tries to wash them. He never gets past 2 before something distracts him. Usually something stupid. Clive's a kid, early 20s. Eyes too wide, voice too loud. He's got this obsession with the occult. Thinks everything that goes bump in the night is the start of a real case. He's not wrong often enough to fire him, but he's not right often enough to trust unsupervised. He came here because he couldn't make it into the police academy. He says it was politics. I say it was his personality. Either way, he's mine now. I let him sit at the desk. I let him answer the phones. Sometimes I even let him talk to clients. Usually once. As for me, well, I've been doing this too long to believe in anything but evidence, rent, and caffeine. My name's not in the door. My face is not in the papers. But if you've got a problem nobody else can figure out, or nobody else wants to touch, well, you end up here. It was just another rainy day in Atlanta when the bell above the office door gave its half-hearted jingle. I didn't look up right away. Rain tends to bring in more leaks than leads. But then I caught a whiff of perfume that didn't belong to Clive or the mold in the walls. She stepped in like she didn't want to be seen doing it. Black dress, tight at the waist, cut just below the knees. Expensive. Same for the sunglasses, which she kept on, even though it was foggy enough outside to lose a Buick. Clive was halfway through pouring some stale coffee into his already stained mug. He stopped, blinking like someone had switched the channel on him. "Can I help you?" I asked, not moving from my desk. She hesitated, then took off her glasses. Her makeup was perfect, but her eyes told the truth. Red around the edges, puffy. She'd been crying, just not today. Probably every day this week. "I heard you handle things," the woman said. "Well, that's one way to put it. Please, sit," I replied. She did. crossed her legs like she'd been taught to do it. Clive hovered by the coffee machine. I gave him a look. He sat down and tried to look useful. "My name is Eve Monroe. My husband passed away 3 months ago. Military, Afghanistan. I was told I might be entitled to speak to someone with expertise," the woman said. "And what? Dead husbands or living problems?" She didn't blink. "Both." I leaned back in my chair, hands folded over my stomach. "Go on." She shifted in her seat. "Well, it started small. Lights flickering, remote going missing, things not working like they should. I thought it was just a house. It's old, probably built before half of Atlanta had running water. But then the lights on the second floor went out and never turned on again." She hesitated, eyes locked on the edge of the desk. "I think there's something in that house. Something evil. I think it's a demon." I ignored her last sentence and focused on something tangible. "Second floor lights?" I asked. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Yes, all of them. Went out last month, but I just paid the electric bill. I called the city. They said it wasn't on their end. Hired an electrician. He said everything looked fine, like someone had deliberately killed the power up there." Clive cleared his throat. "That's real weird, all right." Eve didn't look at him. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small stack of glossy printouts. I started noticing words, spray painted. "In my house, always overnight," she said, laying the photos out one by one on my desk. I leaned forward. The photos weren't fakes. They had the washed-out look of cheap ink on home paper. Kitchen cabinets, bathroom mirror, hallway door. Out. No. Leave. I kept my face still. "Anyone else live with you?" "My son does. Jason, 14. I thought maybe he was lashing out, acting up after losing his father. He's been angry. We've been fighting. I accused him, and he cried. Said it wasn't him. Swore on his father's grave," she said. She reached into her bag again, and her hands shook when she handed me the last photograph. "This was the latest one, from just last week." Bedroom wall, white paint, cheap looking. Above the bed, written in crude letters, "God is dead." I stared at it. She didn't say anything else. The rain hit the windows harder now. Somewhere behind me, the radiator gave a tired clunk. She told me the last thing that happened was the stairs. Her son Jason had been coming down from the second floor when something shoved him hard enough to send him tumbling. 12 steps. He landed face first on the tile and screamed loud enough to wake the whole block. She said she thought he was dead. Turned out it was just a broken arm, but the look in her eyes told me it didn't matter. The real break happened somewhere else. Since then, they hadn't gone back upstairs. Clothes still in drawers, toothbrushes in the cup, beds unmade. She packed a bag that night and took her son to her mother's house a few neighborhoods over. She hadn't set foot in the place since. But she wasn't here to run from it. She wanted it back. Said the house was the last thing her husband left them. Paid off, good bones, decent yard. She talked about it like someone talking about a dog that had gone mean, something loyal that turned on them. But she wasn't ready to let go. She asked us to take the case. She didn't cry, didn't beg, but there was something in her voice that said if we said no, she'd be back at the front door of that house by nightfall with her son in tow. I told her we'd take it. I asked a few more questions, about Jason mostly. His school, friends, behavior. She answered all of them without blinking. Said he was a good kid. Smart. Sensitive. Hadn't been quite right since the funeral. When I asked who sold them the house, she went quiet for the first time. Said her husband bought it at a foreclosure auction. Didn't know who'd lived there before. We went back and forth until I was sure I'd gotten all I could from her to start the case. She was getting ready to leave when I saw it. A small silver cross hanging from a chain, clutched tight in her gloved hand. I hadn't noticed it before. Maybe she kept it hidden until now. As she stood, I caught her eyes again. The Lord is near to the broken-hearted, huh? My grandfather used to always say that. She didn't reply, but I saw her eyes mist over with tears. She nodded and smiled in that way people do when they're trying not to cry, then turned and walked out the door before anything else could crack open. The bell jingled behind her as she left. Clive watched her go, then turned to me with his eyebrows already halfway up his forehead. I didn't think you were the Bible verse type, he said. I went back to the desk, cleared the photos into a pile, and reached for the nearest mug. I'm not. Then why say it? He asked. I paused. Well, sometimes part of the job is giving someone comfort in a way they can understand, especially when their life stops making sense. Clive leaned back in his chair. He didn't argue, just nodded slowly like he understood, even if he didn't quite agree. Before we stepped foot near that house, I made Clive sit down. He was already halfway to the door, practically bouncing, with his usual mix of curiosity and caffeine. I could see it in his hands, in the way he kept checking his jacket pocket, like the keys would teleport him straight to the crime scene. That's how he worked. Chase first, think later. I reached under my desk and pulled out an old laptop. Dust on the lid, sticker half peeled from the bottom corner. It was a 2012 MacBook, one of those gray, heavy ones that used to be cutting edge before the fan started screaming after 10 minutes. I clicked it open. The screen lit up, slow but steady. Clive stared like I'd pulled a rabbit out of a hat. This still works? He asked. Better than you do, I replied. He sat reluctantly. I spun the laptop toward him and waited for the fans to settle. The thing ran like a mule. Stubborn, noisy, but dependable. Now the first thing, it's not about chasing a ghost, I began. It's asking the right questions. You don't walk into a fire before checking where the exits are. Clive muttered something, probably about the thrill of the chase, but he leaned in anyway. To his credit, when he focused, he could dig. I handed him a yellow legal pad and told him to write down everything he found. Names, dates, anything that didn't fit. He started tapping. We already knew the buyer, the husband through foreclosure. What we didn't know was the seller. That was the gap. And gaps are where the good stuff usually hides. It took about 15 minutes before Clive sat straight up. I got something. I looked over his shoulder. The listing from the auction site was still cached. Previous owner, Diana Mercer. The name didn't mean anything to me, but Clive was already down a rabbit hole. Wasn't long before he started pulling up old newspaper scans, the kind no one looks at unless they're really trying. Not archived anywhere official, just second-rate blogs, digitized pages from a neighborhood print, probably shut down years ago. The first thing that came up was the address. It was mentioned in a half-dozen small articles about neighborhood disturbances, all of them vague. People claiming pets had gone missing. Children talking about a woman in the upstairs window when no one was home. Locals called it the witch house. Atlanta's own version of urban legend nonsense. But the more we read, the less it sounded like a campfire story. The articles stopped suddenly, all within the same year, 10 years ago. That's when the reports of the owner's death started showing up. It wasn't front page stuff, but it was too strange to ignore. According to one article, neighbors had reported a foul smell coming from the house. Not gas, not mold, something worse. The kind of smell that creeps under your door frame and settles in your clothes. When no one answered the door, police came to check on her. What they found made the news, and not just locally. She'd been dead in the bathtub. That part wasn't unusual. What was unusual was everything else. The time of death was very specific. 3:07 p.m. Broad daylight. The body had been drained of all blood. Not spilled. Not pooled. Drained. Every vein collapsed. Every artery flattened. Like the body had been vacuum sealed from the inside. The autopsy confirmed it. No blood anywhere in the body. Not even trace amounts. And her left hand was gone. Not severed at the wrist. Not injured. Just missing? Completely. The skin around where the hand should have been wasn't torn or mangled. It was smooth. Closed, somehow. Like it'd never been there at all. But the papers confirmed she had been born with all limbs intact. Police searched the house, the drains, the yard. No hand. They never found it. There wasn't much follow-up after that. No suspects, no motive. No one close to her, no next of kin. The case dried up. The house was emptied, boarded up, and forgotten until it reappeared at a foreclosure auction 3 years later. By then, no one remembered the name. Just the stories. And boy, there were many. Family after family came to live in that house. And family after family left. No one stayed long. Clive was ready to jump out of his chair, practically buzzing. That's it, right? The witch house, the blood, the hand, that explained everything. I didn't answer right away. I closed the laptop and pushed it aside. The hum of the fan slowed down and stopped. It explains something, not everything, I replied. He frowned, like I'd just taken the wind out of his sails. Oh, come on. A woman tied to the occult dies under freaky circumstances, and now 10 years later, weird things start happening in the same house. You really think that's coincidence? No, but this is just the first piece of the puzzle. Don't start framing the picture before we've dumped out the whole box, all right? Clive sat down again, slower this time. So, what do you think we're dealing with? I reached for my coat and stood. Not a demon. He looked surprised. But Miss Monroe? Yes, she thinks it's a demon. That's understandable. She's scared, her son's hurt, and nothing about her life makes sense right now. But what we're looking at is something else. This Diana woman, she wasn't possessed. She was involved. Clive blinked.
Involved how? Witches. Not the broomstick kind. Just people. People who borrow power from something else. So, wait, how's that different from a demon? Well, if it were a demon, I began, we'd be calling the Vatican. So you better hope it's not. He didn't have a response for that. Just grabbed his coat, still thinking. I locked the laptop, pocketed my notebook, and headed for the door. All right, come on. Time to see what's left of the witch house. The Monroe house looked worse in daylight. Paint stripped from the siding, like it'd given up holding on. Porch sagging under its own weight. And no curtains in the windows. Just the blank stare of a house nobody lived in anymore. When we stepped inside, the smell hit first. Wax and mothballs. The kind of stale that sticks to the back of your throat. There was melted candle wax everywhere. On shelves, table corners, dripping down onto the floors. Dozens of candles sat half-burned on every flat surface. Big ones, cheap tea lights, thick ones in jars. I counted 5 on the kitchen counter alone. That lined up. Mrs. Monroe said the electricity upstairs cut out weeks ago. If the breakers didn't fix it and the city wasn't at fault, then they probably gave up and lit candles to see in the dark. Looking around now, it was clear they'd been lighting everything by hand for a while. Clive wandered down the hall and stopped in front of a grandfather clock. The big kind, old-fashioned, dusty. The hands were stuck. He called me over and pointed to the face. 307. He didn't say anything, just walked into the kitchen and looked up at the wall clock. That one was frozen too. Same time, 307. Dead center. That was when I said it aloud. Same time Mercer died. That was the official time of death from the coroner's report. 10 years ago, middle of the afternoon, found drained in her tub. Every clock in this house was still stuck on the exact minute she died. We moved from room to room. Most looked half abandoned, like someone started packing and gave up halfway. Boxes opened but never filled. A suitcase left on the hallway floor, zipper crooked. A child's toy train left mid-setup in the living room. One of the plastic tracks had snapped. In the master bedroom, folded clothes were still sitting in a basket, like someone meant to put them away and never did. A blanket was balled up on the carpet, next to the wall, probably where someone tried to sleep without going upstairs. There wasn't much to the first floor of the house, so we decided to head upstairs. The stairs groaned under our weight as we climbed. The air on the second floor was heavier, carrying the faint smell of dust and wax. Most of the doors were open, but the one at the end of the hall was shut. The master bedroom. I pushed it open, and the first thing I saw was the writing. Black spray paint, wide strokes across the wall above the bed. God is dead. The letters bled into the drywall, uneven, harsh, but the words were unmistakable. Clive pulled something from his jacket pocket, a folded sheet of paper. He spread it open and held it up to the wall. The photo Mrs. Monroe had shown us. The same angle, the same words. The match was perfect, right down to the way the paint ran in a thick drip under the D. He stood there for a long time, eyes flicking between the photo and the wall. Then he spoke. That's from a philosopher. I remember it from a class in college. Can't remember his name, so why here? Why that quote? Why would whatever's haunting this place choose those words?" he asked. I shrugged. Fear, maybe. Fear's fuel. Always has been. Clive lowered the photo and folded it again, slipping it back into his pocket. I could see the gears turning behind his eyes, more questions forming, but I didn't give him the chance. I stepped deeper into the room. The carpet was flattened where the bed had been dragged aside. A dresser leaned crooked against the wall, one drawer half open, shirts spilling out like someone left in a rush. I ran my hand along the nightstand. A thin layer of dust clung to my fingers. Near the far wall, the floorboards looked off, not warped, just scuffed in a way that didn't match the rest of the room. Scrapes along the grain, faint but fresh, the kind left when something heavy gets dragged across the floor. I crouched down and ran a hand along the baseboard. Then I felt a draft that I chalked up to nothing. And that's when I saw it. A seam. Not quite a crack, but enough of a line to break the flow of the wall. I looked up and traced it with my eyes. From the floor all the way to the ceiling, just behind a leaning dresser. "Clive," I said. He turned from the corner, still holding the folded photo. I nodded at the wall. He came over and helped me shift the dresser. It groaned against the floor, but slid easier than I expected. Behind it, the wallpaper was different. It was older and layered, two patterns, one on top of the other. The outer sheet peeled at the corner. I grabbed it and pulled. It came off in long strips, revealing a narrow wooden door, barely wider than a crawlspace hatch. No knob, just a rusted latch holding it shut. I didn't like how low it was. It wasn't built with the house. It was added later, after someone decided they needed it. Clive leaned in. "Think it's a closet?" "Not that kind." "Keep your flashlight on," I said. We undid the latch and opened the door. It creaked stiffly, hinges straining against the ears. The smell changed immediately. Old wax and something else. Faint iron. The flashlight beam cut through the dark. Inside was a small, cramped room, barely big enough to stand in. The walls were scorched near the top, blackened from candle smoke. Melted wax pooled in rings on the floor. Burn marks traced symbols I didn't recognize. And in the center, a stain. Dark, brownish red, uneven. It looked like someone had once been lying there, arms spread, body limp. Clive stepped in behind me, took one look at the stain, and let out a low whistle. "Well, looks like we just found Diana's secret occult room." I nodded once. Yeah, we did. Clive stayed in the doorway, documenting the ritual room with quiet focus. He circled the wax symbols, moving carefully, lifting his phone for pictures and taking his time with every detail. I left him to it and stepped back into the bedroom. Something kept nagging at me. I couldn't put my finger on it until I stopped moving. The draft again. It brushed against my ankle once more, steady and cold, coming up from the floor. That shouldn't have been happening in a house sealed up this tight. I crouched down and scanned the baseboards. Just beneath the wall, the floor showed signs of recent scraping. Narrow lines curved against the wood, Faint, but there. Something heavy had been dragged across this floor. I followed the marks to the hallway and then down the stairs. The trail carried through the living room and out the back door. The breeze was stronger outside, and the air carried that same cold I'd felt before. It led me to the side of the house, where a crawlspace hatch sat half hidden behind dry weeds and debris. The hatch wasn't locked. It had rust on it, but it had been opened recently. I knelt down and shined my flashlight inside. Most of what I saw was ordinary. Loose dirt, forgotten boards, some old insulation sagging between the beams. But something deeper in caught the light. It was pale and shaped like it didn't belong. I swore under my breath, rolled up my sleeves, took off my coat and tie, and slid inside. The crawl space had a low ceiling, just enough to move without my back hitting the beams. The ground was dry and uneven. As I moved forward, a few rats scurried past and vanished into the dark. I kept going without stopping. The further I crawled, the worse the smell became. It made me think of old meat left too long in the sun. The kind of smell that sticks in the inside of your nose. It wasn't overwhelming, but it had settled into the space. When I reached the far end, I found what I'd seen from the entrance. A human hand rested on the dirt. The skin was pale and dry, the nails neatly trimmed. A ruby ring sat on the middle finger, clean and intact. The hand wasn't decomposed, but it gave off the heavy smell of rot. The ground around it was marked. Wax had been poured in circles, some lines still clear, others cracked with age. Small bones had been placed carefully inside the patterns, not scattered, but arranged with purpose. Birds, maybe rodents. Some had been picked clean. Others still held bits of fur. A small altar stood just behind the hand. Stones were stacked with care, blackened from candle burn. Dried blood had soaked into the top layer. The source was clear. A chicken, laid across the top with its neck slit open. The body was limp and stiff, freshly placed. Wedged into the crevices of the stone were Polaroids. Most of them showed ritual scenes, dim rooms, open books, raised hands. Some faces were blurred. One of them wasn't. Diana Mercer stared back at me from the center of the group. Her face was all smiles, like she was having the time of her life. The moment settled in. This was not an overlooked detail from the original police investigation. It was not an ordinary burial either. The hand had been left here, either by Diana or one of her occult followers. It had been preserved, sat in the center of an ongoing ritual space. The witch hadn't just died in that house. Like many of her kind do, she had left a part of herself behind. This was the key. It explained the clocks, the messages, the fear, the reason the house still felt active. It also explained the accidents. Witches are known for staying tied to one place. That shows up in old stories, like Hansel and Gretel. And in real cases too, like the Rhode Island farmhouse back in 1907. The pattern's always the same. A witch makes a deal with something beyond this world, usually a demon, and gains power. That power doesn't belong to them. It's borrowed. And even after they die, The connection sometimes stays open. The house, the land, the objects, they hold onto it. What I found under the Monroe house made it clear Diana Mercer never planned to let go of this place, even after her death. I turned and began crawling back, flashlight steady. The answer had been beneath our feet the whole time, literally. Now I knew how to end it. We had to cleanse the house. It was time to call the priest. It was just after noon when we came back to the Monroe house. The clouds hadn't moved all morning, and the street outside was as quiet as I'd ever seen it. The house looked the same from the outside, but I knew what was under it now. I knew what had to be done. Clive and I didn't come alone this time. I'd called in someone I trusted, Father Daniel. He was an old friend of mine, and he wasn't the type to give long sermons, just quiet words and steady hands. He brought a small bag with him, filled with holy water, a worn crucifix, and a Bible held together with tape. He didn't ask too many questions. He never did when I called. I laid out the plan on the porch before we went in. Each of us would take one space. We needed to cut this thing off from every angle. Father Daniel would walk through the house with prayer and water, blessing the thresholds and corners. Clive would head back up to the hidden ritual room to scrub out the wax circles and burn whatever Diana had left behind. As for me, I was going under. The hand needed to be buried and sealed. Everyone nodded, and then we went in. Father Daniel started in the living room, murmuring words I'd heard him say 1,000 times before under different circumstances. I watched him for a second before heading out the back and around the house to the crawl space. The hatch creaked open as I pulled it loose. The cold draft hit again. I dropped to my knees, flashlight in one hand, small wooden box in the other. Inside the box was salt, packed tight. I crawled back through the same tunnel, the dirt dry beneath my palms. The rats were gone this time. The crawl felt longer now, like the house knew I was here to end something. I reached the same spot, the altar, the bones, the wax, all exactly how I left them. I moved the stones aside and cleared a shallow hole in the dirt. The wax cracked under my hands, flaking apart like old paint. Then, I took Diana's severed hand and placed it in the box, covering it under a thick layer of salt after wrapping it in linen. I filled the hole and the rest of the spiritual space with even more salt, cleansing the area clean. I was done when there wasn't a trace of wax or bones left. I sat back, hands resting on my knees, and looked at the ground one last time. "That's enough now," I said. The house responded as if it heard me. It started as a low rumble beneath me. The crawl space shook hard, knocking dust loose from the beams above. The ground trembled. I pressed my hands to the dirt and waited. Then, with a sharp crack, the world jolted. Wood groaned all around me, and the sound of glass shattering tore through the air above. And then it stopped. Silence followed. Total stillness. I didn't move until it was over. When I was sure nothing else was coming, I turned around and crawled back the way I came. My flashlight beam trembled slightly, dust still drifting through the crawl space. At the entrance, I climbed out, carrying the box with me. The wind outside had picked up just enough to rustle the trees. From where I stood, I could see the windows. Every single one had shattered outward. Jagged glass framed the edges, and shards littered the porch and sidewalk. It looked like the house had exhaled all at once. I stepped through the front door. The living room was covered in broken glass. Father Daniel stood in the very middle of it, still holding his old Bible. A wet streak ran down one wall where the holy water had splashed. He looked at me and gave a short nod. Upstairs, Clive came down slowly, holding his cheek. A thin cut ran just under his eye. Fresh, but not deep. It would scar, though. He looked around, eyes wide, and then locked eyes with me. Is it over? I nodded. It was over. It'd been a few days since we finished the job. The Monroe house was quiet now. No more flickering lights, no more words on the wall. The second floor still needed repairs, and the windows had all been boarded up after the glass blew out. But the house itself was clean. For the first time in a long while, it was just a house again. Mrs. Monroe called and asked if she could stop by the office. I told her she was welcome any time. She arrived in the same black dress she wore the first time, but it looked different now. She stood straighter. Her face looked rested. No makeup today, no sunglasses. Her eyes were tired, but they were clear. Clive greeted her at the door. She sat across from me, folding her hands tightly in her lap. And I told her everything. I explained that the house wasn't haunted in the way people imagine. Diana Mercer, the woman who lived there before, had been a practicing occultist. She wasn't born with power. She made a deal with something. That kind of deal always leaves a trace. Before she died, she left behind more than a memory. She left behind a part of herself. Her hand, hidden under the house, preserved and placed at the center of an altar. That hand acted like a cord tying her to the house. As long as it remained, her influence stayed. The Monroe family was not imagining it. The house really had turned against them. Clive filled in the rest. He told her about the ritual room upstairs, the symbols, the wax circles, and the bones. He explained how he cleansed each space. We didn't leave anything behind. Mrs. Monroe stared down at her lap while we spoke. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she looked up with eyes glassy from held-back tears. She didn't cry, but her voice caught when she thanked us. She stood and reached into her purse, pulling out a thick envelope. She placed it on the desk between us. Then she left, back into the alley, into the city that hadn't stopped moving since the case began. Clive leaned against his desk and watched her go. He waited until the door clicked shut, then turned toward me. You said something earlier about what you found under the house. I nodded. I already knew what was coming. You said there was a chicken. Dead. Fresh. I nodded. He crossed his arms and looked at the floor. But Diana's been dead for 10 years, so she couldn't have done that. That means someone else was feeding the ritual, keeping it going. He let that settle for a second. Exactly, I replied. It wasn't an accident. That chicken had been laid there as an offering. Not random. Someone else knew about the ritual and had been trying to keep it alive. Whether they were part of Diana's group or found her notes later, I couldn't say. But the meaning was clear. Someone had continued her work. Without that sacrifice, the spell would have died years ago. Clive didn't like that. I could see it on his face. So they're still out there? He asked. Maybe, but it doesn't matter. We broke the connection. Without the hand, without the altar, there's nothing left to feed. Whoever they were, they don't have power anymore. He nodded slowly, not happy, but understanding. Outside, the rain in Atlanta hadn't stopped. It pattered against the office windows as Clive poured another mug of whatever passed for coffee that day. The envelope from Mrs. Monroe sat in the desk drawer, unopened. Later, as we looked back and reviewed, we dubbed this the Monroe witch case. You see, not every job ends with all the answers. Some just end. But the house was quiet now, and the family was safe. I listened to the rain outside and stared out the window. Sooner or later, the next person would walk through our door with a story they couldn't explain, and we'd be ready.
Hey everyone, Steven here. I hope you enjoyed the story. In case you haven't watched it yet, just so you know, the full Daggerland series is on the channel. It's about 4.5 hours, and I think you'll really like it. So if you haven't finished the Daggerland series and you'd like something to do, check it out. I will try to put a video link on screen. Also, check out our new Daggerland merch at hauntedstuff.com. There's a link in the description. Thank you for listening and all the support, and I hope you have a great weekend. People never call it what it is. They say big dog, bear. They say something got into the livestock. They don't say werewolf. My name is Matthew. I'm 41 years old, and for the last 12 years I've made a living killing werewolves for counties that don't want headlines and families that don't want reporters on their lawns. I'm not military. I'm not part of some secret order. I grew up outside Ashland, Kentucky. My dad ran a tire shop off US 23. My mom worked nights at a hospital cafeteria. I hunted deer every fall, starting at 13, and that's about as dramatic as my origin story gets. The first werewolf I saw, it wasn't during a full moon in some fog-covered forest. It was behind a Dollar General outside Grayson. Sheriff's Department called it in as a rabid animal. I was 29 and still doing contract pest control. Coyotes, feral hogs, nuisance bears. I shot it twice before I understood what I was looking at. The second time, I didn't hesitate. Word travels in rural counties. After that, I started getting different calls. Quiet ones. The kind where deputies don't file reports. The kind where farmers hand you cash in an envelope and don't ask for a receipt. That's how this job works. No uniforms, no badges, just a truck, silver rounds, and 5 rules. That night we were parked off Kentucky Route 10, half a mile past a rusted farm gate that leaned like it'd given up. The property belonged to a man named Curtis Henson, 62, retired machinist. 3 goats missing in 2 weeks. One found opened up behind the feed shed. Sheriff wrote it up as feral dogs. Curtis called me anyway. I shut the engine off and let it tick down in the dark. The quiet out there was not natural. No insects, no distant highway hum. You hear that? I asked. The kid in the passenger seat shook his head. His name was Brandon Ellis, 24, fresh out of the academy, volunteer deputy. He still checked his rifle every 5 minutes, like it might disappear if he didn't look at it. That's the problem, I said. You think it's here? He asked. It's always here, I began. Question is whether it's alone. He shifted in his seat and adjusted the sling on his rifle. Silver-plated rounds in his magazine. I had 12-gauge slugs in my lap, each one hand-loaded and dipped clean.
thermal monocular hanging from my neck, red lens flashlight clipped in my vest, tourniquet in my left cargo pocket. I don't pack light. You said there were rules, Brandon said. Sheriff didn't mention rules. The sheriff thinks this is animal control, I began. It isn't. I opened the door and stepped out into gravel. The air smelled like cut hay. The farmhouse sat 200 yards up the drive, porch light off, windows black. Beyond it, the barn crouched low and square against the tree line. Brandon came around the hood and joined me. His boots crunched too loud. Roll your feet, I said. He adjusted and tried again. We walked halfway up the drive before I stopped and raised the thermal to my eye. One large heat signature right behind the barn. Not moving much, elevated temperature, roughly the size of a giraffe horse if you were generous. Brandon leaned in. You see it? I see something, I said. We cut left instead of heading straight in. Always change the angle. If it's watching, and it probably was, it expects you to walk right up to the barn door like an idiot. Brandon kept his light low. So, you've been doing this 12 years? Closer to 13, I said. And you've never messed up, huh? I lowered the thermal and looked at him. I've messed up, kid, I began. That's why there's rules. A wooden plank creaked from inside the barn. Brandon's breathing changed. Before we get any closer, I began, you need to understand something. I'm listening. There are 5 rules. You break one and you don't get a redo. He tried to smile, but it didn't stick. What kind of rules? Well, the kind you follow even when you think you don't need to. The heat signature inside the barn moved. It paced once along the interior wall. The outline through the boards wasn't clean, but the height was wrong for a dog. Shoulders too wide, head carried too high. Brandon raised his rifle halfway. Not yet, I said. It looks big. Yeah, big isn't the same as shifted. He glanced at me, confused. Rule 1. Never shoot until you confirm the target is fully shifted, I said. Metal scraped inside the barn. A chain clinked once. Then a low sound rolled out through the slats. Steady, not a bark, not a howl. More like someone clearing their throat before speaking. Brandon flinched. Stay calm, I said. The barn door moved just an inch. Not swinging open, just pressure against it. I stepped sideways for a clearer line of fire, and I felt the gravel shift under my boot. Safety off, I said quietly. Brandon clicked his off. Inside the barn, something heavy exhaled. Welcome to the job. Now listen carefully. The rules are the only reason I'm still alive. And the first one was about to matter. Rule 1. Never shoot until you confirm the target has shifted fully. You don't fire on movement. You don't fire on size. You don't fire because your nerves are screaming at you to do something. You fire when the shift locks. That night behind Curtis Henson's barn, Brandon almost learned that the hard way. The barn door flexed inward again. Not much. Just enough to show something heavy was leaning against it from the inside. I lifted the thermal and adjusted the focus ring. The heat signature was tall. Too tall. It moved with a slow, uneven sway. One shoulder dipped lower than the other. That's the first thing people misunderstand. They think werewolves snap into place like movie monsters. One clean transformation and poof, done. It isn't clean or mechanical. Brandon whispered, That's it, right? Maybe, I began, but not yet. The door slid another inch, and a shape pressed into the gap. At first it looked human, Torso, arms, head bent forward. But the proportions were wrong. The spine curved too far. The arms hung too long. Brandon brought his rifle up. "Don't," I said. "But it's coming out." "Not fully," I replied. The thing inside the barn shifted its weight, and the door jerked open wider with a sudden snap. Wood splintered, where something crawled through the inner brace. A hand came through first. Not a paw. A hand. 5 fingers. Too long. Nails dark and thickened. The skin looked tight over the knuckles, like it'd been stretched. Brandon's breath caught. "It's still human." "It's not," I said. "It's mid-shift." The arm convulsed. I saw the elbow joint snap backward at a wrong angle, and then correct itself with a grinding motion. The fingers curled and lengthened. The nails split and peeled forward into black claws. Brandon's rifle wavered. "Shoot it now," he said. "If you shoot it now, you're just going to make it angry," I replied. The head pushed through next. At that stage, they still look wrong in a way that tricks you. The jaw starts to extend, but hasn't finished. The nose flattens and pushes outward. Teeth lengthen unevenly, some still human, some already fanged. The eyes cloud over and then refocus. Half human, half wolf. And that is the worst version. The door tore free of one hinge as the body forced its way out. Its shirt was half shredded and hanging from one shoulder. Ribs were visible beneath skin that stretched and tightened with every breath. Brandon's finger tightened on the trigger. "Wait," I said sharply. The creature dropped to one knee and let out a low, wet growl. Its spine rippled under the skin like something was crawling beneath it. The shoulder blades pushed outward, forming ridges. The forearms thickened. The sound it made wasn't a howl. It was a choke, like it was swallowing gravel. That's the moment most rookies break. The sound triggers something in the back of your brain. Fight or flight kicks in, and you want to end it. But silver against a half-formed body doesn't kill clean. It shocks. And when you shock something mid-shift, the pain hits every nerve at once. I know because I did it once. Years ago, outside Greenup, I fired too early. The slug caught it in the ribs before the rib cage had finished widening. It didn't drop, it convulsed, and then it came at me with both arms still half human, and it tore open my left thigh before I got a second shot off. I still limp when it rains. Inside Curtis's yard, the creature's jaw snapped forward with a wet crack. Teeth settled into place. The ears pulled up and back against the skull. The torso expanded and unlocked. You can see it when it happens. The shift reaches the end of its cycle and stops adjusting. The movements become coordinated instead of chaotic. The creature stood to full height, close to 8 feet, fur now fully grown across its chest and shoulders. The eyes were clear yellow, focused. That's when it's a werewolf. Not before. "Now," I said. Brandon fired. The first round hit high in the chest. The impact jerked the creature backward a step. Silver burns through them like acid through tin. Smoke lifted from the entry wound. I fired a half second later, and I put a slug through its open mouth. The head snapped back. Bone and fur sprayed across the barn door. It staggered forward anyway. They always do. Brandon fired again. This time the shot caught the shoulder joint and blew it apart. The arm hung useless. The creature lunged on 3 limbs and hit the gravel hard enough to crack it. I stepped in close, and I put the final round into the base of the skull. It went still. We stood there in the dust and smoke, both breathing too hard. Brandon lowered his rifle slowly. If I'd shot when the arm came out, it would have hit mid-rib, I interrupted. And it would have felt every nerve in its body catch fire. He looked at the torn gravel, imagining it. It would have covered that distance before you chambered the next round, I began. And it would have used what was left of its hands to open you up. Brandon gulped. I walked forward and nudged the body with my boot. No movement. The jaw hung slack. The fur was already losing its sheen. You don't shoot until the shift locks, I said. Full height, full structure, eyes focused. He nodded, but his hands were still shaking. I wiped the barrel of my shotgun with a rag and began reloading. The barn behind us creaked as the hinge gave way, and the door fell flat into the dirt. Brandon stared at the corpse. How do you know when it's finished? You watch the spine, I began. You watch the shoulders, and when the movement stops looking painful and starts looking deliberate, that's when you fire. He looked back at me. And if you're wrong? Then you're dead, I said. The wind picked up slightly and carried the smell of blood across the yard. Brandon took a long breath and steadied himself. Well, that's rule 1, I continued. You wait until it's fully what it's going to be. Never before. Behind the barn, somewhere deeper in the tree line, a branch snapped. Brandon's head turned. I didn't move, because one heat signature rarely tells the whole story. Rule 2. Never let one lure you indoors. If it goes inside, you don't follow. I don't care if it drags something in. I don't care if it screams. I don't care if it looks wounded. You keep your boots outside. Curtis Henson thanked us 3 times before we left his property. We loaded the body into the bed of my truck under a tarp and told him to lock his livestock in the steel pen for a few nights. I didn't tell him about the branch snap and the tree line. There's no point in giving a man something he can't fix. Brandon rode quiet on the way back toward town. An hour later, my phone rang. Another call, different county line, edge of Portsmouth, Ohio. A deputy named Aaron King said a woman had reported something huge running into a vacant house off the street. House had been empty 6 months. Bank foreclosure. Windows boarded, but one side door busted open. I didn't hesitate. Still there? I asked. Yeah, we heard movement inside, King said. Then it stopped. Don't go in, I told him. Silence. You hear me? I mean, we were about to clear it, King replied. Do not go in, I repeated. Brandon looked over at me. We're doing another? You want sleep? I asked. He didn't answer. We crossed the river into Ohio just before midnight. The vacant house sat back from the street behind a chain link fence, porch sagging, one upstairs window missing its boards. Streetlights threw long yellow shadows across the lawn. 2 cruisers were parked crooked in the drive. Deputy King stood near the front steps with a flashlight in his hand and his pistol already drawn. You're Matthew? He asked when I stepped out. That's me. He jerked his chin toward the house. We saw something move past the kitchen window. Big. Not a dog. Anyone inside? I asked. Well, house is supposed to be empty. Supposed to be, I repeated. Brandon came around the truck, rifle slung. King eyed him. He good? He'll be fine if he listens, I said. And we walked toward the house together. The front door hung half open. Inside, the living room was dark except for a sliver of streetlight cutting across the carpet. Old furniture still sat in the room, covered in dusty sheets. King lifted his pistol. We were about to sweep. No, I said. He frowned. We can't just let it sit in there. Yes, we can, I said. I stepped to the side of the doorway instead of standing in it, always offset. I leaned in just enough to shine my red lens across the far wall. Scratch marks. 4 long grooves running down from the ceiling toward the floor. "It's in there," Brandon whispered. "Of course it is," I said. A heavy thud came from deeper inside the house. Then another. It wanted us to hear it. King stepped toward the threshold. I grabbed the back of his vest and pulled him hard enough to rock him off balance. "You don't cross that line," I said. He looked offended. "It's just a house." "It is not just a house anymore," I replied. Rule 2 exists because walls compress space. Werewolves don't need distance the way we do. They don't need clean lines of sight. Inside a house, they use door frames like cover. They use stairwells like funnels. They break through drywall instead of using hallways. Out here, I control distance. In there, it does. The thud stopped. Silence. Brandon gulped. "What if it's hiding?" "It is hiding," I began. "And it wants you to come find it." A board creaked upstairs. King's jaw tightened. "We can't just wait." "We don't wait," I said. "We move it." I circled left along the exterior wall, keeping space between me and the windows. Brandon mirrored me. King followed, slower now. We reached the side yard. The kitchen window was broken out, glass scattered across the dirt. I lifted the thermal and angled it through the opening. Heat signature inside. Crouched low behind the kitchen island. Not moving. "See it?" Brandon whispered. "Yes." "Why isn't it coming out?" "Because it wants us to step in," I said. King exhaled hard. "So what do we do?" I stepped back and handed Brandon the thermal. "Watch that window." Then I moved to the back door and kicked it open. The sound echoed through the house. Still no movement. I picked up a brick from the flower bed and I hurled it through the living room window. Glass exploded inward. Still nothing. I grabbed a metal trash can lid from the side yard and I slammed it against the siding 3 times, loud and sharp. A growl rolled out from inside, low and irritated. And there it was. The kitchen window frame splintered as something large shifted behind it. A flash of yellow eyes, fur along the edge of the counter. "Back up," I said. We retreated 5 steps into open yard. The back door shuddered once, and then it burst outward. The werewolf exploded into the yard in a spray of wood and dust. Full shift. Tall, leaner than the one at the barn, and faster. It didn't charge straight. It juked left, then right, testing angles. And that's what happens inside houses. They get used to tight spaces. They learn to bounce off walls and redirect. Brandon fired first. The round clipped the hip. The creature stumbled but kept moving. King fired his pistol twice and missed both times. The werewolf lunged toward the porch, using the railing as leverage to change direction again. If we'd been in that hallway, it would have hit us before we got a second shot. I dropped to one knee and I waited for the turn. When it pivoted toward Brandon, I fired center mass. The slug punched through the sternum. The creature faltered. Brandon steadied himself and put a second round into its throat. It collapsed in the grass 10 feet from the front steps. King stood frozen, pistol still extended. "That's why," I said. He lowered the gun slowly. Brandon looked at the shattered doorway. "If we'd gone inside..." "It would have come through drywall," I interrupted. "Or down the stairs from above you. Or from the crawl space, who knows?" King stared at the broken porch railing. It let us hear it.
Yes.
It wanted us to clear the house.
Yes, I said.
He wiped sweat from his forehead. We almost did.
I nodded.
The body twitched once and went still. Brandon let out a breath he'd been holding. So if it runs into a building,
you don't follow, I said. You flush it out.
He nodded slowly.
I walked to the edge of the porch and looked at the gouges carved into the doorframe. Fresh wood splintered outward. You give it walls, and you give it control, I said. The cruiser's lights flashed red and blue across the front of the house. Neighbors were peeking through curtains now. King holstered his pistol.
That's rule 2, huh?
That's rule 2, I said. I reloaded and stepped back toward the truck. If it goes inside, I continued, you let it come back out. On your terms. Behind us, the house stood open and broken, but we were still standing in open ground. Rule 3. Never hunt alone during a full moon sweep. You don't do this job by yourself. Not on a full moon. Not when sightings start stacking up in the same county. Not when tracks overlap. You think you're tracking one, you're not. 2 nights after the house in Portsmouth, the calls started clustering along the edge of Wayne National Forest. Chickens gone. A calf dragged 20 yards from a fence line. Something seen crossing a logging road near Ironton just after midnight. Full moon was due up at 9:14 p.m. That timing matters. Brandon showed up at my place before sunset. His shoulder was bruised from recoil and lack of sleep. He didn't complain, though.
You think it's connected?
He asked while loading fresh silver rounds into his magazine. Always assume it is, I said. We drove south and cut into the gravel access road that feeds into the forest. The trees out there grow tight. The canopy blocks more light than people expect. Even under a full moon, the ground stays dark. At the ranger gate, we met Deputy Aaron King again. He brought another volunteer, a guy named Trevor Scott. Early 30s, big guy. Confident in a way that comes from not having seen enough yet.
You sure we need 4 of us?
Trevor asked. Yes, I said. He smiled, like he thought I was exaggerating. We parked the trucks nose out for a quick exit and cut our engines. The moon was already rising over the tree line, bright and round and wrong, and that way it gets when it's too clear. I lifted the thermal and scanned the ridgeline. 1 heat signature. Large, moving parallel to the logging road about 100 yards up. There, I said, handing the binocular to Brandon. He looked. Just 1. Right now, I said. Trevor shouldered his rifle.
So we circle it.
No, I said. We move together. He frowned.
If we split up, we can box in.
No, I said. Rule 3 exists because werewolves understand flanking better than you do. They don't talk, they don't signal. They read each other's movement by instinct. You split up, you become 4 isolated targets. We moved into the trees in a tight, staggered line. Brandon behind me, King behind him, Trevor bringing up the rear. The forest floor was dry, leaves crunching under boots, no matter how careful we stepped. I didn't like that. Noise covers approach. The heat signature crossed the ridge again. Trevor leaned forward.
We've got it moving.
It's letting us see it, I said. The shape disappeared behind a thick stand of pines. Brandon whispered, "Lost it." I took the thermal back and adjusted the angle. 2 new heat blooms appeared. 1 to our left and 1 to our right. They hadn't been there 30 seconds earlier. "Stop," I said. Trevor stepped forward anyway.
It's splitting up,
No, I said. We're being split.
The original signature reappeared ahead of us and broke into a run across the ridge, fully visible now in the moonlight. Tall and lean and fast. Trevor raised his rifle and took a step toward it. The left side heat signature started moving. Fast. Left! Brandon shouted. A massive shape burst from behind a fallen log then, and it charged straight at Trevor. He barely had time to pivot before it hit him in the chest and knocked him backward into a tree. King fired once and missed. The wolf snapped at Trevor's arm and tore fabric but didn't get flesh. The third heat signature flared bright behind us. The decoy on the ridge had stopped running. It turned. And now all three were oriented toward us. Back to back, I yelled. We tightened formation. That's the difference between living and dying in a pack encounter. You don't chase or pursue. You hold center, and you force them to come through you. The left wolf lunged again. I fired into his shoulder joint. The silver slug ripped muscle and spun it sideways, but it didn't drop. Brandon pivoted and fired right, catching the second wolf across the ribs. It staggered and snarled. The one on the ridge let out a long, rising howl. It wasn't random. It was coordination. The injured wolf pressed in again, not retreating. Trevor finally got a clean shot off and blew a chunk out of its flank. The third wolf came downhill. Fast. I felt the ground vibrate before I saw it fully. Down, I said. Brandon dropped to one knee and fired upward as the creature cleared a fallen branch mid-leap. The round caught it in the lower abdomen. It crashed short of its target, and it rolled hard across the forest floor. King moved to finish the injured one on the left. Don't chase, I said. Too late. King stepped forward 2 paces to get a better angle, and the right side wolf used the gap instantly. It slammed into him from the side, and it drove him into the dirt. I fired at near point-blank range, catching it behind the ear. The skull cracked, and it went limp across King's legs. The third wolf, the one Brandon had hit mid-air, was already scrambling to its feet. It wasn't retreating. It was recalculating. Trevor, bleeding from a shallow gash on his forearm, raised his rifle and fired twice in quick succession. The first missed. The second hit center chest. The wolf staggered but didn't fall. Full moon. They don't feel pain the same way under a full moon. I stepped forward, planted my feet, and waited for the charge. And it ran toward me, head low, arms wide. I aimed for the mouth and fired. The slug punched through the upper jaw and exited behind the skull. The body folded inward and skidded to a stop less than 10 feet from us. Silence dropped back over the forest. Trevor was breathing hard. King rolled onto his side, groaning. Brandon kept scanning with a thermal, hands shaking. One more? He asked. I swept the tree line. Nothing. Just residual heat from our bodies. King pushed himself up. Dirt and blood streaked across his uniform. If we'd split up, you'd be gone, I said. Brandon looked at the dead wolf near his boots. They used a decoy. Yes, they did, I said. Trevor wiped blood from his forearm.
I thought we could box it.
You don't box a pack, I said. You try and survive it. He nodded, slower now. We stood there under the moonlight, just staring out in front of us. Rule 3 isn't complicated. You don't hunt alone when the moon is full, because when you think you're tracking one, you're already inside a triangle, and triangles close fast. Rule 4. Some of them aren't bad. Don't kill the wrong one. Now, most of them are killers. That part doesn't change.
Most of them don't care about fences or property lines. They don't care about livestock tags or porch lights. They hunt what moves, and if it's smaller than they are, they take it. But every once in a while, you find one that isn't hunting, and if you shoot that one, you don't just make a mistake. You create a problem that follows you for years. We got the call outside Vanceburg, Kentucky, just before dusk. A couple in their late 50s reported a giant creature in their backyard. The husband said it was standing upright and holding something long and sharp. That description puts your pulse up fast. Long and sharp means weapon. Brandon and I pulled into the gravel drive and cut the engine. The house sat back from the road with a small fenced garden beside it. Wooden tomato cages, fresh turned soil, a stack of bagged fertilizer near the shed. The husband met us on the porch. His hands shook while he talked. It was big, the husband said. Standing in the garden. Did it attack anything? I asked. No. It was digging, he said. Digging? Brandon asked. Like it was burying something, the husband added. Brandon looked over at me. We walked around the side of the house and stopped at the fence line. I shut off my flashlight and let my eyes adjust. And there it was. Full werewolf. Broad shoulders, thick fur down its spine, standing over a row of freshly turned soil. In its hand was something long and metallic. Brandon lifted his rifle. Hold, I said quietly. The creature bent forward and drove the metal object into the dirt. I raised the thermal monocular and scanned the yard. One heat signature. No movement beyond the steady rhythm of digging. The metal object caught a bit of fading light. Shovel. This is our chance. Let me shoot it, Brandon said. The creature stopped digging, and it turned its head slowly in our direction. Its eyes reflected the last bit of sunset. It straightened to full height, still holding the shovel. Brandon tightened on the trigger. Don't, I said. The werewolf looked at us for a long second, and then it spoke. I'm not a bad one, idiot. What? Brandon said, blinking. The werewolf shifted the shovel in his hands and scowled. I'm planting my damn tomatoes, it said. There was no growl in its voice. I lowered my shotgun slightly. Sorry, I said. The werewolf glared at us another moment, and then it turned back to the soil. It stabbed the shovel into the ground again. Scrape. It paused and glanced over its shoulder. People see fur and they lose their damn minds, it muttered. And then it went back to digging. Brandon slowly lowered his rifle all the way, and we stood there watching for a few seconds. The werewolf straightened again, wiped dirt off one claw against its leg, and walked toward the edge of the yard with the shovel over its shoulder. I can't even go outside for a bit of moon air and plant my damn tomatoes without idiots running about trying to shoot me and whatnot, the werewolf muttered as it shook its fist at us, and then it disappeared fully into the tree line. Brandon exhaled hard. We almost shot him. Yeah, I said. He was holding the shovel, Brandon said. He looked toward the dark trees where the werewolf had gone. What if we'd killed him? He asked. Be glad we didn't, I replied. He nodded slowly. Now, remember, most of them are bad. But every once in a while, you find one that just wants to be left alone. Rule 4 exists because your job isn't to kill everything with fur and claws. It's to kill the ones that deserve it. Rule 5. If you see two of them fighting, leave them alone. You don't step between them. You don't take advantage of the distraction. You don't move closer for a clean shot. You back up.
You wouldn't jump between two rabid dogs tearing at each other in a yard, would you? Now multiply that by 10. We learned that one outside Ironton, Ohio, 3 nights after the Forest Pack encounter. Call came in around 1:20 a.m. 2 different residents reported large animals fighting near an abandoned storage facility off State Route 93. One caller said it sounded like trucks crashing into each other. Accurate. Brandon and I pulled into the cracked asphalt lot and killed the headlights before we reached the chain-link fence. The moon was high and bright enough to cast hard shadows across the rows of metal roll-up doors. We heard it before we saw it. A deep, vibrating snarl. Then impact. Metal buckled somewhere in the darkness. Brandon said, "That's not one." We moved along the fence line and found a gap where the chain had been torn loose. I raised the thermal, and I scanned over the rows of units. 2 heat signatures, both enormous. They weren't circling, they were colliding. One slammed the other into a row of storage doors hard enough to dent the steel inward. The second wolf twisted, clamped its jaws into the first one's shoulder, and drove it sideways across the pavement. The sound wasn't howling. It was bone and muscle hitting metal. Brandon leaned forward. "They're distracted." The 2 wolves rolled across the asphalt, claws tearing grooves into the surface. One got on top and drove its forearm down into the other's throat. The lower wolf kicked upward and sent them both crashing into a stack of plastic bins outside one of the units. The bins exploded into pieces. Brandon shifted his stance. "If we take the dominant one first..." "Back up," I interrupted. He looked at me like I was wasting an opportunity. That's the trap. Now, when 2 werewolves fight, it's not a duel. It's not about territory in a way you think. It's like a violent hierarchy correction. Whoever wins walks away stronger and meaner. And if you interrupt that process, both of them redirect at you. One of the wolves broke free and staggered backward, chest heaving. The other followed immediately, not giving it space, not letting it disengage. They slammed together again. The ground shook under our boots. Brandon took one cautious step forward through the fence gap. I grabbed the back of his vest, and I pulled him hard enough to make him stumble. "Do not go in there," I said. "They're right there." "And they will both turn on us if we move closer," I replied. As if to prove the point, the larger of the 2 wolves paused mid-strike and lifted its head. It sniffed the air. The smaller wolf twisted free and lunged again, but the larger one wasn't focused on it anymore. Its eyes shifted toward the fence line. Toward us. "Back," I said. We moved 5 steps away from the opening. The larger wolf shoved the smaller one aside and took 2 deliberate steps in our direction. The smaller wolf came at it from behind and sank its teeth into the back of its thigh. The larger wolf roared and spun, slamming the smaller one into a storage unit door so hard the metal bowed inward. And that's what saved us. If the second wolf hadn't re-engaged, the first one would have charged the fence. Brandon's breathing was fast now. The smaller wolf's leg bent in an unnatural angle under the larger one's weight. The larger wolf clamped its jaws around the smaller one's throat and drove it down out of the asphalt. There's a moment in those fights where it shifts from struggle to execution. You see the resistance fade. The larger wolf held its grip and shook once, and the smaller wolf went limp. Silence fell heavy and sudden across the lot. The standing wolf lifted its head slowly. Blood ran down its chest. One eye was half swollen shut. Its rib cage rose and fell in deep pulls. It turned fully toward the fence then. Toward us. And this is the part rookies get wrong. They think the fight weakened it. It didn't. It thinned competition. The wolf took a step forward.
then another. It wasn't charging yet. It was deciding. I raised my shotgun but didn't step through the fence. Brandon brought his rifle up. "Wait for the angle," I said. The wolf advanced 3 more steps into the open lot, leaving the body behind. It lowered its head and let out a low growl. If we'd been 10 feet closer, it would have closed that distance before we could chamber another round. It crouched. That was the decision. I fired first. The slug hit high in the chest. The impact staggered it, but didn't stop the forward motion. Brandon fired half a second later, catching it across the lower ribs. It charged then. Not straight. It veered left, then right, testing the fence gap. I stepped sideways to widen my line, and I fired again, this time aiming for the open mouth. The slug punched through the upper jaw. The wolf slammed into the chain-link fence hard enough to make it rattle and sag. Brandon fired one last round into its neck. The body slid down the fence and went still. We held position for a full 10 seconds. No movement. No heat shifts on thermal. Just 2 massive shapes on the asphalt. Brandon lowered his rifle slowly. He looked through the fence at the torn-up lot, the gouges in the pavement, the bent metal doors, the body lying twisted near the storage units. "They weren't ignoring us," he said. "They were prioritizing." "Well, you don't break up a fight between dogs," I began. "You don't get between bears. And you don't put yourself into a werewolf fight thinking it's your moment." Brandon looked at the dead wolf slumped against the fence. "They multiply everything by 10, he said quietly. Now, Rule 5 isn't about courage. It's about survival. If you see 2 of them fighting, you let them finish. And then you deal with what's left. Well, by the time we left the storage lot, the sun was lifting over the trees. The chain-link fence still sagged where one of them had slammed into it. The storage doors were bent inward, like someone had taken a sledgehammer to them. 2 bodies lay under tarps in the bed of my truck, heavy and still. By midday, deputies would file a report about wild animals. The dents would get blamed on vandals, and life would keep moving. Now, like I said, most werewolves are bad. Most of them don't try to live quietly. Most don't plant gardens. Most don't mind their own business. They move at night. They test fences, they circle houses. They kill. That's the part people are right to fear. But not all of them are the same. Every once in a while, you find one that isn't prowling, isn't stalking, one that looks irritated more than predatory when you shine a light on it. You learn to see the difference in how they stand, how they move, and whether they're coiled to strike or just trying to be left alone. You don't learn that from stories. You learn it from standing in enough yards and enough forest and enough empty parking lots to know what you're looking at. You learn it by surviving your mistakes. And you always remember the rules. You don't shoot until the transformation is complete. You don't follow one inside a building. You don't hunt alone on a full moon. You don't kill the wrong one. And if you see 2 of them fighting, you stay out of it. That's it. 5 rules. You follow them, or you become a lesson.
My name's Abel. I'm a vampire hunter. It's not a job you apply for. No diploma, no orientation videos. It's something you're either born into, or you die figuring out. Me, I was born into it. Born and raised in rural Kansas, not near any city people think of when they picture the state. Just fields and fence posts, dirt roads, a few houses spread out like dots on an old map, 1 diner, 2 churches, 3 families that stayed put for 4 generations. Ours was one of them. My folks were honest about why they had me. It wasn't love or planning or a miracle. They had me because the line needed to keep going. The way other families hand down farmland or debt, mine handed down sharpened stakes and books with handwritten notes in the margins. They told me when I was 5 that I was the next in line. I didn't go to college, never even filled out an application. My school counselor tried to talk to me once about scholarships and careers. She had this brochure in her hand, something with a smiling kid holding a laptop on a campus lawn. I told her it wasn't going to happen. She thought I meant we couldn't afford it. I didn't bother correcting her. Let her think it was about the money. The truth would have made her very uncomfortable, and I've never been the type to talk more than I have to. I wasn't raised like other kids. I didn't have baseball practice or summer camps. I had morning drills with Dad. Every Saturday at dawn, rain or shine, he'd wake me up, hand me a wooden dowel the size of a sword handle, and we'd practice. Not flashy, movie-style stuff, just stance, grip, movement. He taught me how to move my feet so I wouldn't trip in gravel. Taught me how to read signs in dirt. Taught me how to tell when a smile is too wide or when someone's voice is a little too smooth. That's one of the first things you learn. Vampires don't all act the same. They don't all wear black or slink around like they've got something to hide. They adapt. They learn fast. Down south, they sing a lot. They've got these syrupy voices, like honey poured over warm cornbread. Sweet and slow. Folks let their guard down real easy down there. In Boston, they're a little different. Rude, even. Talk fast, move faster. Can't waste time when the city doesn't sleep. In Asia, they're more connected, networked, less individual predators, and more like cells in a bigger thing. That part scares me more than anything. Cities, that's where the worst ones hide. They've been there longer. They've learned how to blend. Some run companies. Others work late-night shifts. The longer they're around people, the more natural they seem. You might be wondering if I resented it. The training, the pressure, the strange lifestyle. I didn't. I still don't. I never had that weird teenage crisis of who am I or what do I want to be. I knew. I always knew. When my friends were flipping through career books, I was memorizing bloodlines. When they went to prom, I was practicing how to disable someone without killing them. I didn't envy them. I didn't even think they were wrong. Just different. It's not a glamorous life. No awards, no recognition. Nobody throws you a parade when you stop something very bad from spreading. You just pack up and drive to the next place. But there's something clean about it. Something honest. When I hunt, I know exactly who I am. There's no guesswork, no pretending. I don't lie to myself about the world being fair or people always being good way deep down. I see things as they are. My mom taught me that part. She wasn't a hunter like my dad. She was the researcher. She tracked patterns, kept logs, wrote down everything they learned, what worked, what didn't, what changed from place to place. She'd sit at the kitchen table late into the night, poring over old cases. Her handwriting sharp and neat, like every letter mattered. She'd say things like, "They get smarter every year," or, "You have to listen more than you talk." Dad handled the fighting. Mom handled the thinking. And I learned both. Some people think hunting's all about strength. It's not. It's about patience, about listening, about knowing when not to act. Sometimes you wait 3 weeks in a town without doing a damn thing, just watching, listening, following a trail that might not lead anywhere. But if you're lucky and quiet and careful, you'll find something. And if you're not careful, it'll find you first. I've been at it on my own for, 7 years now, since I was a teen. Dad passed away before I finished my training, but he left enough behind for me to keep going. Notes, letters, tips on places to avoid, people to trust. There's a woman in Ohio who makes custom weapons, a trucker who runs supplies across state lines, no questions asked, a preacher in Louisiana who can tell when someone's not quite human. These aren't friends, they're contacts. That's another thing you learn. You don't get too close to anyone. Sooner or later, you'll have to leave or bury them. I'm writing this down now because, someone has to. Mom kept records. She said memory fades, but ink lasts. It's my turn now. Every little thing matters. Patterns, words, faces. Someday, someone else will need this, like I did. So I write it all down. My name is Abel. I'm a vampire hunter. And these are my stories. I was 18 the first time I killed a vampire. That age where you don't feel like a kid anymore, but you still think like one. You're out of school, no longer told where to go or when to wake up, and yet you haven't really lived anything. There's a strange confidence that comes with that in-between. You believe you're ready for the world, mostly because you don't know what the world is capable of. My father used to say that 18 was a dangerous age. You have energy and instinct, but your judgment hasn't caught up yet. He called it the edge, and said everyone has to fall off at once. For me, it happened in rural Kansas, inside a church basement that had gone sour without anyone noticing. I was staying in town to help one of my dad's old friends fix a roof and look into some local rumors. Nothing official, just quiet work, watching from a distance. But trouble never follows your calendar. It shows up when it wants to. After service one Sunday morning at St. Luke's, the local priest pulled me aside near the gravel parking lot. His shirt collar was loose, and his hands shook when he spoke. He didn't ask questions or explain himself, just passed me a folded piece of paper and told me to read it later. Alone. I waited until I was a few blocks away before I opened it. The handwriting was messy. It read, "I believe something is hiding in the basement. Please come after dark, and do not bring anything that looks like a weapon." That last part told me the priest had a gut feeling about what he was dealing with. He didn't know the rules, not in full, but he understood enough to keep quiet and not make a scene. I returned to the church the next evening, just after sundown. The main doors were locked, but the priest met me at the side entrance near the rectory garden. He didn't say much. We walked through the narrow back hallway, past classrooms and storage closets, and eventually came to the stairs behind the altar that led to the basement. Then he left, telling me he couldn't bear to find out what devil had been haunting the basement. He offered a prayer, and back up he went. As soon as I stepped down the first few steps, I could feel the shift in the air. The wood underfoot creaked more than it should have, and the temperature dropped with each level. I stopped at a narrow door marked storage. I opened it with a brass key the priest had given me, and stopped. There were empty blood bags, medical grade, scattered nearby, torn apart with sharp teeth and carelessness. The light overhead was dim and flickering, but I could make out a figure crouched in the corner, partially hidden by an old wire rack. He was humming. Not a melody I recognized, just a soft, slow sound, like he was keeping rhythm with his breath. As I stepped closer, I saw him more clearly. A man in a tailored vest with his sleeves rolled to the elbow, kneeling over a half-torn blood bag. He didn't see me. That's something they do. When they feed, they lose their awareness. It's a moment of weakness, kind of like being drunk. They forget they're predators, forget the world outside is their prey. My father taught me that if you ever catch one in that state, you don't hesitate, and you don't wait for it to turn and recognize you. You act. I stepped forward fast and drove the sharpened chair leg I'd been carrying into the upper back, aiming low between the shoulder blades. The man jerked violently. His body collapsed onto the floor in a heavy sprawl. I pulled the stake out and struck again, this time straight through the middle. He twitched once, then stopped moving. The vampire didn't look special in death. No claws, no monstrous transformation. Just a man in clean clothes with a little blood on his collar, until his body began to break down. Within seconds, the skin cracked, the muscle caved in, and he disintegrated into a pile of fine ash. The smell hit me next, sharp and bitter, like coffee grounds soaked in cheap alcohol. It stung the nose, clean and unnatural. I left the room and locked the door behind me. The priest was waiting upstairs, pacing in the hallway. When he saw my face, he stopped. "It's done. You don't have to worry about him anymore," I said. He opened his mouth like he wanted to ask a question, but nothing came out. And I gave him a warning before I left. Don't open your doors to strangers anymore. If someone stops outside and asks to come in, even if they sound friendly, even if they look like they belong, do not let them pass the threshold. If they were human, they wouldn't have to ask, I said. My father came into town the following day. I didn't go into detail. He could read the aftermath without being told. It wasn't a hard case to solve. Just a simple stray vampire with no backup and no real plan. The kind that slips into a place unnoticed and feeds quietly until someone gets wise. It was more like taking out a nest of bugs than anything else. No mess, no moral knots to untangle. We spent the day reinforcing the church, replacing logs, spreading salt in the corners, and fixing the window frames. When it was done, he dusted off his hands and looked at me. Then he gave me a single pat on the back. And that was the moment I knew that I wasn't on the edge anymore. I'd gone over. There wasn't any going back to before. Not mentally, not spiritually, not in any way that counted. I'd crossed the line. The next one happened when I was up north in Chicago. I was there on business. But I'll admit something. I like the city. The lights made everything glow like it was on fire, and the buildings stretched so tall, they looked like they were leaning over you. I love the buzz of it. The mess, the noise, the way everyone always seemed just a little pissed off, but, never surprised. The people don't hide who they are, and that went a long way with me. They'd curse you out, cut in front of you in line, and maybe even shoulder you without an apology. But they meant what they said. You didn't have to waste time figuring them out. And the food? The best I ever had came out of a kitchen that could barely fit the chef himself. I ate standing up in an alley behind the place because the shop had no seating. Didn't matter. The bread was still warm, and the meat had this spice that stayed on your tongue like it was making a case for itself. Even now, I remember the taste better than most of the faces. But I wasn't there for a vacation. I'd been tracking a vampire that had slipped out from Oak Brook. Mid-level parasite, smart enough to relocate before people caught on. I followed its trail to a nightclub on the west side, the kind that didn't bother with signage or security. You only got in if someone thought you were cool enough or dangerous enough. I wasn't either, but I knew how to look like I belonged. The place was packed, people sweating under pulsing lights, music thudding loud enough to blur your thoughts. I was on the second-level walkway, keeping eyes on the far corner where my mark had disappeared half an hour earlier. He was the type that moved slow in crowds, like he was walking through fog. Real vampires do that sometimes. They never rush anymore. Not like us humans living on borrowed time. And then, just as the bass dropped into another song, I heard a gunshot from the alley outside. It cracked against the back wall like a whip, sharp and unmistakable. Some people turned. Most didn't. I didn't wait. I slipped out the back entrance. In the alley, I saw two figures. One of them was already running, fast and crooked, stumbling down the narrow lane toward the street. The other was standing still, silver gun raised, smoke still curling from the barrel. I moved in quickly and looked down at the pavement near the doorway. The blood on the ground wasn't pooling. It was sizzling where it hit the concrete. And that was all I needed to see. Only one kind of blood does that. "You shot a vampire," I said. The kid turned to me, probably around 17 or 18, wearing a jacket with too many pockets and a patch on the sleeve I didn't recognize. His hands were slightly shaking, not from fear it looked like, but from adrenaline. He was riding the high of it. "Damn right I did. I clipped him, I think," he said. I stepped closer. Yeah, you don't shoot in a crowd. You don't fire in a nightclub alley where they're still feeding and you have no clue how many are inside. You shoot, it runs, and now it's hungry and pissed off with no leash, I said. He raised an eyebrow like I just insulted his mother. "You a hunter?" "Vampire hunter, yeah. You?" I replied. He gave a half smile, then pointed to the patch on his sleeve. "Institute. Monster Division. Name's Milo." And that was when it all made sense. Vampire hunters and monster hunters, we don't mix well. We're cousins, not brothers. Same family tree, but on branches that don't speak unless they have to. I was homeschooled, in a way. Trained by my father, who was trained by his father, tested by small-town cases and long drives. These institute kids, they go to training camps and sleep in bunkhouses, write field reports, and do tests on werewolves in glass cages. I mean, come on. I've never liked the way they walk into a place with their heads already full of theory. Dad said they'd increased their efforts in recruitment the last 7 years. In my opinion, that just meant the newer ones were more full of shit. Milo looked at me and shrugged. "Whatever, man. It's handled." "No, dude, it's not." "It got away," I began. "That's not handled. You left a live one with no plan, no tail, no scent trail, and a wound to remind it who burned it," I said. He made some smart-ass comment I don't remember word for word. Something about how I sounded like a dad who used to walk uphill both ways. I didn't respond. There wasn't any point. I spent the next 4 days tracking the one he'd let slip. I followed a missing persons report that matched the profile. The vampire had holed up in a shuttered apartment complex near the edge of Little Village, a place scheduled for demolition that never quite got there. No one checked it anymore. The door was chained shut from the outside, but the inside told me everything I needed to know. The smell of decay was thick. There were drag marks on the floor, dry blood trails leading down into the basement. I marked the door frames, set the garlic smoke canister near the stairwell, and laid sage at each window crack. When the time came, I lit the fuse and waited. The smoke went down first, thick and sharp, designed to disorient and sting. I followed right after, stake in hand, ears tuned to movement. He came out of the dark fast, but not fast enough. His face was half burned from the herbs, eyes watering, body uncoordinated. The stake hit home on the second try. He made a gurgling sound and collapsed without ceremony. I stayed for a long while after that, just to make sure no one else was hiding. I never saw Milo again in Chicago. He probably got sent to some other city, or back to whatever institute dorm they were keeping him in. Now, most of my tips come from people, regular ones. A bartender who noticed a regular stopped drinking. A janitor who found weird stains in a school basement. A pawn shop owner who swore a guy pawned a Rolex soaked in something that wasn't water. But when I'm in a city, I have one guy I go to first. Zazo. He's a goblin. Lives in the sewer systems under the city. Says he likes the smell. And I don't question it. Zazo's not exactly friendly, but he's reliable. You give him what he wants, and he tells you everything. He doesn't take cash, and he doesn't care about favors. He only wants two things: fresh apple beer and full-size Snickers bars. Has to be both. One without the other, and he'll throw it back at you. He's done it to me a couple times. This time, I brought 2 6-packs and a plastic bag with 6 bars, still cold from the cooler. He sniffed them both before he even looked me in the eye.
You finally bring me the real kind? Or did you get that light crap again?
He said. Yeah, it's regular apple beer, and 6 whole Snickers full size. You counted last time, I said. Zazo let out a wheezing sound that might have been a laugh. He took the bag and popped one of the beers open using his sharp little teeth. He drank half of it in one go, foam sticking to his chin like shaving cream.
All right. You brought what I like. What do you want?
He asked. I told him about a small suburban neighborhood on the edge of the city. Quiet place. Nothing remarkable. But lately, the police blotter had started filling up with low-level crimes. Break-ins, missing pets, theft, minor arson. More troubling was the spike in homeless disappearances. People thought it was a coincidence or maybe a serial killer. I knew better. When the most vulnerable start disappearing first, it usually means something is feeding. Zazo nodded slowly as I spoke, his eyes narrowing with each word.
Yeah, you're right. Something's in the water. Word is a coven's been growing fast. Got too big for their old holes, so they've been spreading out. City to city, tasting what's new. Trying to get smarter, he said.
He licked chocolate off his fingers before continuing.
Well, they're not all together. The coven, it's like a big tree. You've got the root, but 100 branches. You're looking at one of those small branches, a side group. Greedy little freaks. Didn't wait for orders. Just marched in and started feeding.
Where? I asked.
He grinned. Abandoned laundromat. East side. It's a front. No one washes clothes there. Not even the rats. It's the entrance to their nest. And your problem is only gonna get worse. They're sloppy. They're high on blood. And they think no one's watching.
I nodded and stood up. He watched me gather my things.
You know, other hunters come to this city, but none of them respect the value of the informant. They think they can all do it themselves. Kick doors, swing swords, shoot monsters in the middle of the street. Bunch of amateurs, he said.
I handed him another Snickers. Well, that's why I come to you first. He tucked the candy into a pouch on his hip and looked proud, like a king getting tribute. He didn't say goodbye. He never does. I spent the next 3 days planning the bust. These things can't be rushed. Monsters in groups are more dangerous than alone. They get confident. They start organizing. If you take them head on without prep, someone dies. And I've buried too many someones already. I scouted the building first. It looked dead from the outside. Half the windows boarded, signage faded to the point of invisibility. The door was chained shut, but I could see movement inside at night. Not much, just enough to confirm they weren't keeping normal hours. I called in a few people I trusted. One of them was a gear tech who specialized in detection equipment, old Institute dropout who preferred freelancing. Another was a field medic who'd patched me up more than once. I reached out to an Institute hunter for backup. I try to avoid working with them unless I have to, but a good hunter is a good hunter, even if he files reports after. We met twice before the operation. We had garlic canisters, UV flash units, stakes, blades, and enough salt to make the whole place unfriendly for anything with fangs. I went over every escape route, every possible complication, and what to do if the place turned out to be deeper than expected. When the day came, it was God's good Sunday. Morning felt clean, bright sun, families out walking. A perfect day to pretend nothing was wrong. We rolled out quiet. 3 vehicles spaced out over 6 blocks. The laundromat was in a pocket of old buildings and empty storefronts, the kind of spot people pass without noticing. As we approached, I felt that shift again. That sense that something lived behind the walls that didn't belong to our world. I'd felt it before. Never gets easier. I stood across the street for a moment, looking at the chipped paint and rusted siding. The windows were dark. No sound came from inside. No movement either. But I knew better. I could feel it in my teeth. The whole place was tense. "You ready?" the Institute guy asked, tightening his vest straps. I didn't answer right away. I was looking at the cracked sign above the door. Spin City Laundry in faded red letters. Probably hadn't run a washer in 10 years. I adjusted the strap on my pack, checked the stake at my side, and gave a single nod. We surrounded the place just after noon. Streets were mostly empty. The kind of quiet that makes you second guess how loud your boots are. There were 5 of us. I took point on the front door with the Institute guy watching my 6. 2 others circled around back to seal off the alley. The last stayed posted on the side in case anything tried to slip out through the basement windows. We laid garlic along the back wall and window sills. It burns their lungs and eyes, but that's not always enough. Silver is better. Some say real silver is God's metal, that no matter what kind of monster you're dealing with, it burns them the same. Vampire, ghoul, siren, even the nice ones that just want to be left alone. Doesn't matter. Silver makes them bleed and scream. It's like we were given one thing, just one, to defend ourselves with. Something they can't undo or outgrow. Their speed, their teeth, their unnatural power doesn't mean much when silver touches them. I loaded my gun with silver rounds and gave the signal. A sharp wave of my hand down and a short nod. Then we moved. The front door led straight into the laundromat. Cracked tile floor, 3 dead machines, a broken vending unit, and fluorescent lights that blinked. We cleared the front quickly. Nothing there but mildew and bad wiring. The real action was behind the false wall, through a busted outdoor frame where the plaster had been torn off and a narrow hall led into the attached house. It was hotter in there, thick with smoke. Someone had been burning incense non-stop, a heavy mix of dried herbs that clung to your skin and made your head swim. The air stung my eyes. I pulled up a cloth mask over my nose and motioned for the others to do the same. And then I saw them. People, at least 10, maybe more, scattered through the living room and into the hallway. All of them were unconscious or close to it. Some curled into cushions like they'd passed out mid-conversation. Most were women and unhoused men. All of them had pale skin and dark stains at the neck. Not fresh wounds, just slow, steady feeding. They were being kept in a fog, breathing in sedatives while their blood was taken little by little. I gave the signal, sharp and short. We moved in silently, each of us grabbing one person at a time and carrying them out. I watched every exit as my team moved back and forth like clockwork. One by one, the bodies were hauled out and laid onto tarps in the lot out front, where the medic could check vitals and prep IV drips. Most of them would live, though I'd bet a few wouldn't remember much beyond a blur of heat and sleep. Once the last victim was out, I motioned for 2 men to follow me. We cleared the hallway and turned the corner, where a stairwell climbed to a second floor. The carpet was matted with dirt and dark spots. I stepped lightly, gun raised. At the top of the stairs was the master bedroom. The door was halfway open, and something inside moved. I stepped in first. The room was dim. Thick curtains blocked out the sun. In the corner, crouched low over a figure slumped on a stained mattress, was a vampire. It didn't turn when we entered. Its face was buried against the victim's neck, body hunched, back rising and falling as it drank. The victim was still twitching, a young man, probably homeless, dragged off the street like the others. We didn't speak. I fired first. The silver round caught the vampire in the shoulder. The second man fired a moment after me, catching it in the hip. The creature howled and turned towards us, blood still dripping from its mouth. Its eyes were wide, more animal than human. It lunged. The third bullet missed. It knocked my partner down with a blow across the head and leapt for me. I didn't wait. I pulled the trigger again. The fourth bullet hit straight through the heart. It froze mid-motion, mouth still parted. Then it dropped. We stood still for a moment, gun still raised. My teammate on the ground cursed under his breath and sat up slowly. I pulled him back toward the wall and told him to sit still until the medic arrived. He nodded, eyes glassy. I was about to call it in when I heard something small from across the room. A faint thump. I turned and followed the sound to the bedroom closet. Inside, curled up on a pile of old towels, was a girl, 12 maybe. Thin arms, scraped knees, dirt on her face. She wore a UCLA t-shirt that was much too big for her, the kind of shirt you might find in a donation bin or on a sale rack for 50 cents. She didn't scream. She just looked at me with wide eyes and didn't move. "You're safe," I said. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes went wide, and her hands gripped the hem of the oversized shirt. I kept my voice low and steady. "What's your name?" I asked.
Maya.
"Hi, Maya. I'm Abel." She nodded, still not blinking. "Can you tell me how you got here?" I asked.
I don't know. A man said I could wait inside for my mom. He said it was warm. And then I woke up in the closet."
"You did good, Maya. You stayed quiet." I held out my arms. "Is it okay if I carry you?" She nodded again, slower this time. When I lifted her, she wrapped one arm around my neck, weak but sure. "You're gonna be all right. We're taking you to someplace safe," I said. Outside, the team cleared a space. We laid her gently onto a stretcher. She was breathing steady. The medic looked over her and nodded. I stayed long enough to ride with her to the Hunter-sanctioned hospital on the edge of town. The staff knew what to do. Discreet, fast, trained to handle situations like this without asking questions they didn't want answers to. I stayed until she was stable, then slipped out before press or family could show up. The case was closed. Victims rescued. Threat eliminated. Everyone would sleep a little easier, at least for a while. But I made a note in my journal that night. There was only one vampire in the house. One. That didn't sit right with me. A whole coven doesn't move in and only leave one behind. That's not how they operate. After the job, I stuck around for a few extra days, worked with the Institute guys to access their older reports, cross-check missing persons cases, feeding patterns, relocation logs. Then I called my mom, She still keeps tabs on movement trends, even in retirement. Between her notes and what I saw, the pattern was clear. Covens have been moving more. Not just growing, but spreading out, shifting territory, faster and more coordinated than before. That means one thing. There's more work ahead. Well, I'm 30 now. My friends, the few I've kept, like to joke that I'm going gray around the sideburns. They say I'm aging like a war veteran, 10 years ahead of schedule. I tell them it's just the lighting. Truth is, they're right, and I don't mind. You don't do this job expecting to look young forever. You do it knowing every year you get is earned. Zazo's still around, same as always. Still in the sewer. Still picky about his apple beer. Still counting the Snickers bars before he talks. He says I'm the only one who brings the good kind. The kind with the crunchy peanuts and no funny labels. I bring him what he asks for, and he keeps me in the loop. There are worse arrangements. As for me, I'm still out there. Still chasing things that most people don't want to know exist. Still watching alleyways, checking basements, taking quiet calls from voices that are too afraid to go to the police. The cities change, the names, the faces, the news cycles, they move fast. But the monsters don't. They're patient. They wait. And as long as they're out there, I'll be hunting.
Commercial flying isn't mysterious. People who don't do it for a living tend to think it is. They imagine turbulence as danger, clouds as concealment, altitude as risk. From the cockpit, it's the opposite. Everything's measured and mapped. Every airway, altitude, every transition point exists because someone long before you figured out the safest, most efficient way to move aluminum through the air. By the time you reach an airline cockpit, the romance is gone. You trust procedures because they work. You trust instruments because they don't care how you feel. You trust airspace because it's regulated down to the mile and the minute. The sky, as far as we're concerned, is owned. Most flights blend together after a while. Push back, taxi, line up, climb, cruise, descend, land. Weather is either something you work around or something you delay for. Traffic is background noise. Emergencies are rare, and when they do happen, they follow predictable patterns. That's why training exists. That's why checklists exist. You're taught early on not to personalize anomalies. Systems fail sometimes. Humans make mistakes. You correct, continue, and you log it in if you need to. Aviation is built on the idea that nothing should ever surprise you. And for most of my career, that was true. I have flown in every condition that makes passengers grip armrest and swear off flying forever. Severe turbulence, lightning crawling across the windshield, winds strong enough that landing felt like setting the airplane down sideways. And none of that stuck with me. None of that even made me question the job. What stuck were the flights where nothing went wrong. Clear weather, normal traffic, nominal systems. Those are the ones that bother me now. There's a confidence that comes with airline flying that's hard to explain unless you've been there. You're not wondering what's around you. Between GPS, inertial systems, radar, traffic displays, and constant communication with air traffic control, there shouldn't be anything you don't know about in the sky around you. The phrase we use is situational awareness, and modern cockpits are designed to make it nearly impossible to lose. You know where you are, who's above you, who's below you, who's crossing 10 miles ahead, and who will be there in 5 minutes. The margins are tight, but they're intentional.
That's why when something doesn't line up, it's unsettling in a way turbulence never is. Turbulence is chaotic, but it follows rules. Wind shear, thermal activity, mountain waves, you can point to causes. You can explain it and brief it. You can predict it. What I'm talking about are moments when the sky behaves like it skipped a step. I didn't notice it at first. Most pilots wouldn't. The first few times it was easy to write off as clerical noise. A bad timestamp, a delayed data entry, somebody on the ground clicking the wrong field in a system that feeds a dozen others. Aviation runs on layers of software stitched together over decades, and small errors happen. But small errors don't repeat cleanly. They don't show up across independent systems that aren't supposed to talk to each other. They don't persist after you double check them. And they definitely don't leave you with the feeling that something arrived before it should have. There's an unspoken rule in this job. You don't chase ghosts. If you start treating every irregularity as something ominous, you'll burn out fast. You stick to what you can verify. You fly the airplane. You let maintenance worry about hardware, and dispatch worry about paperwork. Still, there are things pilots talk about quietly, usually off the record. Things that don't fit into reports cleanly. Routes that feel short on certain days. Calls that don't quite sound right until later. Visuals that vanish the moment you look away. Nobody frames these as stories. They're anecdotes, delivered flatly, usually followed by a shrug. Aviation attracts practical people. We don't lean into mystery. And that's why it took me years to accept that what I was seeing wasn't random. It wasn't weather or fatigue, and it wasn't coincidence. The sky behaves the way it does because we expect it to. Because we assume distance is fixed, time is linear, and airspace is consistent. Almost all of the time, those assumptions hold. Almost. The flights I'm about to describe didn't involve emergencies. No maydays or screaming alarms or heroic landings. They were ordinary flights that ended with data that didn't belong to them. And once you notice that kind of thing, it becomes harder to ignore the days when the sky feels just a little too efficient, a little too close. Alright, well, let's get to incident 1. The suitcase that arrived first. This one didn't feel important at the time. If anything, it felt like a mild inconvenience wrapped in somebody else's problem. We were already taxiing in when the cabin crew called up to the cockpit to let us know a passenger had a question about their bag. That happens on almost every flight. People worry their luggage didn't make it. They misread the carousel numbers. They assume the worst before the aircraft door is even open. We told the lead flight attendant to have the passenger check with baggage services at the terminal. Standard response. We shut down, ran our checklist, and opened the door. Nothing unusual. The flight itself had been unremarkable. Short hop with clear weather and light load. Smooth ride the whole way down. We'd been a few minutes early on arrival, which always feels like a small victory, even though it doesn't actually change anything. I was finishing up paperwork when the same flight attendant came back up front. She said the passenger was insisting that their bag was already waiting for them. I remember half smiling and saying something like that'd be a first without really thinking about it. She didn't laugh. She said the passenger had a photo. That got my attention. I followed her off the aircraft and down into the jet bridge where the passenger was standing with their phone out. Middle-aged guy. Calm, not angry or excited, just confused. He showed me a photo of his suitcase sitting by itself near the carousel. It was unmistakably his. Distinctive color, scuffed corner, a ribbon tied to the handle. The timestamp on the photo showed it'd been taken 10 minutes earlier. At that point, I assumed it was a reused bag photo from a previous trip. People do that sometimes. They try to prove a point by recycling evidence. I don't know, it's strange. And then he showed me the baggage claim notification. His bag had been scanned into the destination system before we landed. That's the part that still sticks with me. Airplane baggage handling is messy, but it's not magical. A bag doesn't exist in the arrival system until it's physically offloaded, scanned, and inducted onto a belt. Every step is logged automatically. It's not dependent on one person remembering to click a button. I told him to head to baggage services and said I'd check with ground operations. Again, nothing dramatic, just due diligence. By the time I got back to the cockpit, the first officer had already heard about it from the ramp crew, and they were just as confused. We pulled up the timeline. Departure scan, correct. Bag loaded on our aircraft at the origin. Weight and balance reflected it. Cargo door sealed. Arrival scan, time-stamped 7 minutes before touchdown. I checked the flight log to make sure it wasn't misreading something. The aircraft's on-block time was recorded properly. The arrival scan predated it cleanly. Not by seconds, by minutes. Ground ops assumed it was a system sync issue. That's the phrase they used. A delay between systems updating or a cached entry being released early. Sounded reasonable enough. These systems are old, layered and patched, sometimes temperamental. Still, it bothered me. I asked if any other bags from our flight had similar timestamps. They didn't. Just the one. Maintenance checked the cargo door seals as a formality, and everything was normal. Dispatch reviewed the load sheet. Normal. The bag tag number matched the passenger. No duplication or misroute. Eventually, the explanation settled on data irregularity, which is airline shorthand for "we don't know." The passenger got his bag, and it was intact. No damage or missing things. He thanked us and left. And that should have been the end of it. But later that night, after we'd flown another leg and parked for the evening, the first officer brought it up again. He asked if I'd ever seen anything like that before. I said no. He said neither had he. What made it worse wasn't the anomaly itself. It was how clean it was, No errors or system meltdown, It was like one object behaving as if distance didn't apply to it. Well, a few weeks later, something similar happened on a different route. Different aircraft and crew and airport. Same result. A bag scanned into the arrival system early. This time, the difference was that someone noticed before the aircraft even landed. Ground ops flagged it while we were still on descent. They assumed the bag had been misloaded onto an earlier flight. It hadn't. The tag trace showed it loaded onto our aircraft at the origin. The ramp cameras confirmed it. The bag never left the plane. Yet there it was, logged as having arrived. Again, no other bags showed the same behavior. Again, the explanation was quietly closed as a system error. Well, I started asking around, casually, over coffee during layovers, in the way pilots talk when they're not writing anything down. A cargo captain told me he'd seen a pallet register as delivered while they were still over the ocean. He'd laughed it off at the time. Another pilot mentioned a wheelchair that appeared at the gate before the aircraft reached the stand. He said he assumed it was a coincidence until he realized the gate hadn't been assigned yet. None of these incidents were alarming on their own. Nobody filed safety reports or escalated them. They didn't affect operations. But they shared the same shape. An object arriving before its carrier. At first, I told myself I was looking for patterns that weren't there. That's human nature. Once you notice something odd, you start seeing it everywhere. But I kept quiet records just for myself. And the more I looked, the more strange things got. Incident 2 The missing minutes. Now, the next one didn't involve baggage or ground systems. It involved us. It was a medium-length domestic leg, long enough to settle into cruise, but short enough that you're paying attention to the clock. Those flights live and die on timing. Fuel planning, descent profiles, crew duty limits, everything is built around predictable minutes. Weather was clear from departure to destination. Not mostly clear, but clear. No convective activity. No jet stream anomalies worth mentioning. No altitude changes requested. It was one of those days where flying feels almost automated. We leveled off early and settled into cruise. Engines were stable. Fuel flow was exactly where it should be. Ground speed was normal for the altitude and wind component we had. Nothing unusual. About halfway through the leg, air traffic control asked us to confirm our position. That's not unheard of, but it's a little uncommon. Normally, they already know. Radar, ADS-B, transponder returns. Our position is being tracked constantly. I read back our coordinates. There was a pause on the frequency. Then ATC asked us to say it again. I did, and there was another pause. They came back and asked if we could confirm our ground speed. I glanced down, read it off, and looked at the first officer. He shrugged. Everything looked fine. ATC acknowledged and told us to continue as cleared. And that was it. Now, if that had been the end of it, I wouldn't be telling this story. A few minutes later, we were handed off to the next sector much earlier than expected. The first officer noticed it at the same time I did. He tapped the navigation display and asked if I thought the wind data had updated incorrectly. We cross-checked and it hadn't. The forecast and actuals were aligned. I pulled up the flight plan timing. According to the numbers, we were ahead. According to the engines, we weren't. According to the ground speed, we weren't. According to the clock, we were. It didn't add up. Well, the rest of the flight went normally. Descent, approach, landing, all standard. It wasn't until later, after shutdown, that things started to bother me. I pulled the post-flight data out of habit more than concern. Engine trends were clean. Fuel burn was exactly where it should have been. No spikes or anomalies. And then I looked at the recorded timestamps. The flight data recorder showed a gap. The aircraft transitioned between two logged waypoints faster than the distance between them should have allowed. The timestamps were clean, sequential, no errors. It was as if the airplane had covered a stretch of airspace without spending the expected amount of time inside it. I showed it to the first officer. He frowned, recalculated it manually, and came to the same conclusion. We went through every reasonable explanation. There's no tailwind, no altitude deviation, instrument error, cross-checked across independent systems. GPS glitch, well, possible, but unlikely given the consistency across multiple sensors. Eventually, we landed on the same conclusion aviation always does when something doesn't affect safety. Log it and move on. So we did. The next time it happened was 3 months later. Different route and aircraft, similar length. Same result. This time, ATC noticed again. They asked us to slow down. That got my attention. You don't get asked to slow down in cruise unless spacing is off. We reduced speed slightly, well within normal limits. A few minutes later, they asked us to slow again. We complied. According to them, we were closing on traffic ahead much faster than expected. According to our displays, we weren't. There was no visual traffic, nothing on the scope. After landing, I requested a copy of the ATC timing data through normal channels. They took a while. By the time it came back, I'd almost forgotten about it. The timestamps didn't match ours. Their system showed us passing through controlled airspace earlier than our onboard systems indicated. I stopped talking about it openly after that. Not because anybody told me to stop, but because I recognized the look people gave me when I brought it up. Aviation doesn't reward curiosity unless it improves safety or efficiency. Everything else is noise. Still, I started paying closer attention. Some flights felt longer than scheduled. Some felt shorter. Most felt normal. The ones that didn't weren't tied to weather or traffic or aircraft type. There was no consistent pattern I could point to. No particular altitude or latitude that explained it. Just stretches of sky that seemed to let you through faster than they should. I didn't feel anything during those moments. No physical sensation or visual distortion. No sound. If you weren't watching the numbers, you'd never know anything had happened. That's the part that bothers me. If something dangerous is happening, you expect warning signs, Alarms, vibration. This didn't feel dangerous. It felt efficient. Like the sky had decided we didn't need to spend as much time there. After the third occurrence, I stopped assuming it was a coincidence. After the fourth, I stopped telling myself it was fatigue. After the fifth, I started wondering what would happen if we stayed inside one of those compressed stretches longer than usual. So far, we never have. Not deliberately, anyway. And that's probably for the best. Incident 3. This one took time to understand. At the moment it happened, there was nothing about it that felt wrong. It sounded exactly like a pilot doing his job. We were in cruise, mid-morning, clear skies, international airspace, but well within normal commercial corridors. The radios were busy in the way they usually are. Position reports, altitude confirmations, handoffs between sectors. Nothing stood out. And then a call came in on our frequency. It was brief and professional. The voice identified an aircraft by call sign and tail number, stated their position, altitude, and heading, and requested confirmation of traffic in the area. Standard stuff. I glanced at the traffic display. Nothing showed nearby. Before I could respond, ATC came back and acknowledged the call. They issued a routine advisory and cleared the aircraft to continue on course. The exchange was clean, textbook phraseology, nothing improvised. The voice sounded calm. Male, middle-aged, if I had to guess. Slight accent, hard to place but not unusual. Pilots fly internationally all the time. I remember thinking briefly that his radio sounded a little older. Not bad, just flatter, less processed. But that could have been anything. Radio quality varies. We never saw the aircraft. Not visually. Not on TCAS. Not on radar. That, too, isn't unheard of. Sometimes traffic is below radar coverage, or shielded by terrain, or filtered out momentarily. It happens. A few minutes later, the aircraft called again. Same voice and calm tone, same professional cadence. They thanked ATC and reported clear of the area. Then the frequency moved on. The rest of the flight was uneventful. We landed, parked, and went about our day. It wasn't until that evening, during a layover, that the first officer brought it up. He asked if I'd noticed that the call sign sounded unfamiliar. I shrugged. Call signs change. Charter flights, cargo ops, repositioning legs, you hear all kinds of identifiers. He said he'd tried to look it up out of curiosity. It wasn't in the system. That's unusual, but not unheard of. Databases lag. Temporary call signs exist. Military flights sometimes don't populate civilian systems correctly. By the time he showed me what he found, my stomach dropped. The aircraft wasn't missing from the database. It had been removed from it decades ago. The tail number belonged to an aircraft that disappeared over open water more than 50 years ago. No distress call or debris field, no confirmed crash site. It was one of those cases aviation historians argue about. Fuel exhaustion versus mechanical failure versus weather versus something else. The official record listed it just as lost. The call sign had been retired shortly after. No other aircraft had used it since. The hair on my arms stood up when I read that. We pulled the cockpit voice recording from our flight, and the transmission was there, clear as day. We played it back multiple times. The voice hadn't changed, no distortion, no background noise that didn't belong. No indication it was anything other than a normal radio call. ATC confirmed they'd heard it too. When we asked if they'd pulled the aircraft's radar track, the answer came back short and final. There was no radar track, no primary return or secondary transponder. Nothing. Just a voice. Someone suggested it might have been a replay, an old transmission bleeding through, a recording accidentally rebroadcast. That explanation didn't hold. It wasn't a tape. It was interactive. The internal discussion stopped there. Not because anyone ordered it to stop, but because nobody wanted to push it further. There are moments in aviation where you realize you're brushing up against something that doesn't have a checklist. We were quietly advised not to file anything formal beyond noting unidentified transmission. That phrase covers a lot. The recording was archived, and life went on. I told myself it was a coincidence layered on top of another coincidence, that the call sign match was unfortunate, but meaningless, that someone somewhere had reused an old identifier without updating a database. Except that didn't explain the tail number, or the fact that the aircraft described its position in a way that placed it exactly where the missing plane would have been, given its last known heading, adjusted for modern routing. That detail came out later, during an off-the-report conversation with someone who'd looked deeper than they were supposed to. The next time I heard that call sign, it wasn't on one of my flights. It was over coffee, in a crew room halfway across the world. Another pilot mentioned it casually. Said he'd heard a strange transmission once that didn't match anything on his displays. Said the voice sounded old-fashioned, whatever that means. When I asked him what the call sign was, he hesitated. Then he told me. And it was the same one, same number. He hadn't looked it up because he hadn't wanted to. Neither of us said anything else after that. There are ghosts people talk about in aviation. Phantom airports, runways that appear in fog, lights that don't belong to anything. Most of those stories get exaggerated with retelling. This one does not need embellishment. Incident 4. The Blue Orbs. Now, by the time this happened, I'd stopped assuming that every strange event would announce itself as strange. Most of the things that stayed with me didn't arrive with alarms or urgency. They showed up quietly, like something that expected to be seen eventually. This was a night flight over open water. Long haul, high altitude. The kind of route where there's nothing to look at outside except stars and the faint reflection of the cockpit on the glass. These flights are monotonous in a way that actually sharpens your awareness for me. There's less visual clutter, fewer radio calls, fewer distractions. You notice small things. The first officer was the one who saw it first. He didn't react right away. He leaned forward slightly, adjusted his seat, and looked again before saying anything. That's a habit most pilots develop early. Confirm with your own eyes before you bring someone else in. After a few seconds, he said, "Did you see that off the left side?" I followed his gaze. At first, I assumed it was a reflection. That's almost always the answer. Internal lighting, instrument glow, a star lined up just wrong. I shifted my head and changed angles. The light didn't move. It was blue, not white blue or strobe blue, a deep, saturated blue, like a welding arc seen from a distance. It sat slightly below our altitude, a few miles off our left wing, steady and constant. Then a second one appeared. Then a third. They didn't pop into existence. They faded in smoothly, as if they'd been there the whole time and we'd only just noticed them. They weren't flashing or rotating. They were leaving contrails or reflections. They just sat there matching our speed. And that's when the first officer quietly said, "Those aren't stars." I checked TCAS. Nothing. No traffic or altitude returns or warnings. I checked the weather radar next. Completely clear. Well, we altered speed slightly. Not enough to be operationally significant, just enough to see if relative position would change. It didn't. The lights adjusted with us. Not aggressively or suddenly, just enough to maintain spacing. And that was the moment the cabin got real quiet. Neither of us reached for the radio right away, not because we were afraid to, but because we didn't yet know what we'd be reporting. Pilots don't call ATC to say, "There's something weird." You need specifics. Altitude, bearing, distance, behavior. I keyed the mic and asked ATC if they had any traffic near our position. They didn't. I asked again, more specifically, giving relative bearing and altitude. Negative traffic. I asked if any military activity was scheduled in the area. None. We watched the lights for several minutes. They didn't approach or retreat. They didn't cross in front of us or fall behind. They behaved like formation traffic. Except there was no aircraft. Eventually, one of them moved. It didn't accelerate away. It didn't climb or descend in a way that matched aircraft performance. It simply slid laterally, arcing around our nose and repositioning itself on the right side of the aircraft. The movement was smooth, and that's when I felt real unease. Because I'd heard about this before. Not in rumors, not online. In official briefings and incident summaries that never quite make the headlines. Commercial pilots in Europe have reported blue lights pacing aircraft at cruise altitude. Navy pilots off the US East Coast have described spherical objects that glow blue or white and maneuver without visible propulsion. FAA safety reports include entries describing unidentified luminous objects maintaining formation for extended periods before vanishing. There was a widely reported case years ago involving pilots over the Pacific who described blue orbs orbiting their aircraft at altitude. Another involved airline crews over the Middle East seeing similar lights during night operations, recorded by multiple cockpit crews independently. Those reports are always written carefully. No speculations, just behavior. And that's exactly what we were seeing. The orbs weren't affected by our wake. They didn't drift when we altered heading slightly. They weren't buffeted by air currents. They behaved like they were in their own environment, intersecting ours temporarily. Well, after about 10 minutes, ATC called us. They hadn't seen anything on radar, but another aircraft behind us had reported unusual blue lights in the same general area. That did something to my sense of scale. This wasn't isolated to us. We weren't being singled out. We were passing through something other crews had encountered too. The lights didn't vanish all at once. One dimmed and faded. Another followed a minute later. The last lingered the longest, holding position off the right wing before sliding backward and disappearing into the dark. No acceleration or flare, just gone. The rest of the flight was quiet. After landing, we wrote it up the only way you can write something like that up. Precise and minimal. Behavioral. No adjectives that didn't belong. 3 blue luminous objects observed at cruise altitude. Maintained relative position. No TCAS return, no radar contact. No turbulence or system anomalies. That's it. Later during the layover, a different crew approached us quietly. They asked if we'd seen anything unusual on the route. They didn't need to explain further. They had. And it was the same color and behavior and quiet departure. Now, nobody suggested aliens. Nobody joked. Nobody speculated. That's not how pilots talk about things that make them very uncomfortable. We talked about what happened, then we moved on. But from that point forward, whenever I flew at night over open water, I found myself scanning the dark a little more carefully. Incident 5, the red sky. This was the first time the sky stopped behaving like sky. Not visually strange in a subtle way or ambiguous. Not something you could rationalize if you stared at it long enough. It was very wrong. Now, this was a night flight over continental airspace, well within controlled routing, nothing remote or exotic. Weather briefings were clean across the board. No convective activity, no high cloud tops, no anomalies. The first half of the flight was uneventful enough that neither of us would have remembered it otherwise. The first sign came from the horizon. At first glance, it looked like distant weather illuminated by city glow. That happens sometimes. Storm systems can reflect sodium vapor lights and create strange colors at night. But this wasn't reflected light. The sky ahead of us, it was red. Not streaked, not layered or moving. A deep, uniform red filled the entire forward view, from left to right, from below the nose to well above our altitude. It didn't brighten gradually, it was simply there, like a wall we hadn't noticed until we were close enough to see it. I checked the weather radar immediately. Clear. I adjusted the tilt, increased gain, switched modes. Still clear. The first officer leaned forward, eyes fixed on the windshield. He didn't say anything at first. The red didn't get closer the way weather does. It didn't resolve into clouds or bands. Didn't change shape. It waited. And then the turbulence hit. Not chop or gradual build. The autopilot disconnected hard, and the aircraft lurched as if it struck resistance. Wasn't air pressure, it was something denser. The controls responded normally, but the feedback felt very wrong, like flying through a medium that wasn't uniform. And outside, the red intensified. And then things started to move inside it. These were not vague shapes. These were enormous. The first one became visible as a silhouette against the red, then resolved enough that scale became impossible to ignore. It was massive, longer than our entire wingspan, moving slowly across our forward field of view. It wasn't flying the way aircraft fly, it was swimming through the red, its body undulating as if the sky itself had depth. Then another appeared, and another. They were huge. Not large animal huge, continental shelf huge. The kind of size you associate with deep ocean creatures. Things that only make sense where pressure and darkness hide scale. One passed close enough that I could see structure. There was a head. There were wings. More shapes followed, some vertical, rising through the red as if ascending from below. others horizontal, gliding past at different depths. One moved beneath us, and the aircraft jolted again, like we'd crossed a wake. The first officer said something then. Disbelief? ATC called us. They asked if we were experiencing turbulence. I answered yes and requested an immediate deviation. They approved it instantly. The turbulence intensified again. The aircraft shuddered as another massive shape passed close enough that I could see it. One of the creatures turned, and I don't want to describe it. I committed to a full reversal. Not a standard deviation or gradual turn. I turned the aircraft back the way we came. As the turn completed, the red began to collapse. It didn't fade, it was like it folded. The sky ahead compressed inward, forming a circular distortion, darker at the edges, lighter in the center. And then we crossed a boundary. The sky snapped back to normal. Black, empty stars. The turbulence stopped instantly. Autopilot re-engaged without complaint. All systems stabilized. No warnings or residual effects. It was like it hadn't happened. ATC called again, asking us to confirm heading and intentions. I told them we were returning to our departure airport due to unforeseen severe turbulence. That was true. The landing was uneventful. Maintenance found nothing wrong with the aircraft, no damage or sensor faults. The flight data showed sharp turbulence events, and it showed nothing else. Of course it didn't. Later, in a quiet room, the first officer asked the only question that mattered. What do you think would have happened if we kept going? I didn't answer. Now, this last incident is very hard to explain, not because it was frightening exactly, but because it was ridiculous. There was no red sky or lights, no voices on the radio. It was just weather. At least that's what it was supposed to be. We were on descent when the turbulence started. Not unusual at that altitude. Little rougher than forecast, but nothing that justified concern at first. Then it intensified rapidly. Sharp jolts, sudden drops, impacts against the fuselage loud enough to be heard over the engines. It sounded like hail. That's what I told the cabin crew. Secure the cabin, expect a rough ride, standard procedures. We checked weather radar. Nothing. No cells or returns or precipitation. And then something struck the windshield hard enough that both of us flinched. Another hit followed, then several more. Rapid, uneven impacts, like we were flying through a dense shower of debris. The aircraft shook violently. The turbulence wasn't smooth or patterned. It felt chaotic, as if objects were striking us from multiple directions. We slowed. We descended faster than planned. ATC asked if we needed assistance. I told them we were encountering severe turbulence and possible hail. That was the closest word available. By the time we broke out into clear air, the impact stopped as abruptly as they'd begun. The rest of the descent was smooth. The landing was uneventful, though the aircraft did need inspection before the next leg. That didn't surprise anyone. Hail can do serious damage even when radar misses it. What surprised everyone was what maintenance found. There were small, colorful fragments smeared along the leading edges of the wings, in gaps near control surfaces, embedded in places hailstones shouldn't reach. At first, one of the mechanics thought it was insulation or paint transfer from ground equipment. And then he picked one up, and it was sticky. Another one was intact enough to identify. A jelly bean. Not melted or burned, just cracked and flattened from impact. They found hundreds of them. Different colors: red, yellow, green, purple. Some stuck to the wing like residue. Others lodged in seams and crevices. A few had bounced hard enough to leave faint dye streaks in the paint. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Eventually, someone asked if a catering cart had exploded midair. It hadn't. Someone else suggested cargo contamination. Yeah, there was no cargo like that on board. Weather logs were checked. No reports of hail. No storms anywhere near our route. No explanation for why candy would be falling from the sky. The official report listed unknown foreign object debris associated with severe turbulence. The jelly beans were cleaned off and disposed of. I think I even saw a couple of our guys eating them. No samples were kept, as far as I know. Of all the things I have seen flying, that's the one people laugh about when they hear it. Even other pilots. Especially other pilots, and I don't blame them. But every time I see a maintenance crew inspecting wings after turbulence now, I think about how easy it is for something absurd to slip through the cracks of explanation. There was no monsters or lights or warnings. Just a hell of a lot of candy falling from an empty sky. Well, I still fly. That's usually the first question people ask when they hear some version of these stories. They expect hesitation or a change in tone, or an admission that something broke permanently in my brain after all this. It didn't, as far as I know. I still trust the airplane. I still trust the systems. I trust the people I fly with. Aviation works because it is built on discipline, repetition, and the refusal to panic when something unexpected happens. None of what I've described took that away from me. What it changed was how I think about the sky. Pilots are trained to believe that airspace is consistent, that distance in physics behaves the same everywhere, that time passes at the same rate regardless of where you are, as long as your clocks agree. We treat the sky like a three-dimensional map you can fold neatly into numbers. And most of the time that model works. But not always. Over the years, I've come to accept that there are pockets of airspace that don't behave the way the rest of it does. Places where objects arrive early, where time compresses, where voices come from aircraft that never landed, where lights pace you without showing up on anything that's supposed to see them, where entire sections of sky change character without warning. None of this happens often. That's important to understand. If it did, aviation wouldn't function. Flights wouldn't arrive. Systems would fail constantly, and people wouldn't shrug these things off and keep going. The rarity is what allows it to exist unnoticed. Most pilots go their entire careers without encountering anything like what I've described. Many who do encounter it will dismiss it, forget it, or decide it isn't worth talking about. This job doesn't encourage philosophical detours. We don't get paid to wonder. Still, there are quiet adjustments people make. Routes some crews don't like. Headings they avoid if they don't have to take them. Sections of sky that feel off on certain nights for reasons no one writes down. Now, none of this is official. None of it shows up in manuals. It doesn't need to. Aviation is full of unspoken rules. No, I don't think the sky is hostile. That's the part people get wrong when they hear stories like this. They jump straight to fear or invasion or intent. What I've seen doesn't feel aggressive exactly. Maybe it's indifferent. Like we're passing through systems that weren't designed with us in mind. The red sky didn't chase us. The lights didn't intercept us. The creatures didn't react beyond noticing that we were there. Even the jelly beans, as absurd as that sounds, didn't feel targeted. They just happened. I don't know if that makes it better or worse, because it suggests that whatever else exists up there isn't concerned with us one way or the other. It's like we're incidental, Most days we move through the sky unnoticed. Some days we brush up against something larger. Now, I don't tell passengers about any of this. I don't hint at it. I know a lot of people are afraid of flying. People deserve a calm flight. They deserve confidence. They deserve to believe that the sky behaves the same today as it did yesterday. And most of the time it does. If there's any advice buried in all this, it isn't about fear. It's about humility. The world is bigger than our systems. The sky is older than our maps. Just because we've learned how to move through it efficiently does not mean we understand it.